Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Sleepwell, here to help you unwind and drift into a peaceful sleep tonight. So, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready for a soothing journey filled with calming and satisfying stories. But before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. I always hated that old chest. It sat in the corner of the attic, covered in dust, hidden behind forgotten relics of the past. My grandmother had left it to me when she passed, along with all the other things she had collected over the years. I had no interest in it at first, just another piece of her clutter, something to be ignored in favor of more practical things. But there was something about that chest that nagged at me, something I couldn't shake. It wasn't the size of it or the way it looked, it was the feeling it gave me. Every time I passed it, I felt an odd sense of unease, like it was alive in some way. But it wasn't the chest itself, it was what I felt was inside it. One evening, as I was rummaging through boxes in the attic, I decided to finally open it. I didn't know why. Maybe I was looking for something to remind me of my grandmother. Something tangible to hold on to, something that would make her feel close again. Maybe it was simply curiosity, but whatever the reason, I approached the chest with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The lid creaked when I lifted it, and a musty smell hit me, a combination of old wood and something darker, like decay. I winced and forced myself to peer inside. The first thing I saw was a collection of dolls, their glassy eyes staring back at me. There were other toys too, stuffed animals, toy soldiers, miniature furniture. But the dolls stood out the most, their expressions frozen in time. I should have closed the chest then, should have turned away and left it alone. But something stopped me. Something about the dolls seemed to call to me, to draw me in. I reached into the chest, picking up one of the porcelain dolls. It was smaller than the others, delicate, its dress faded and torn from age. But as I held it, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it. It felt wrong. There was something in the way the doll's eyes followed me. I set it back in the chest quickly, almost as though it had burned my hand. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, like a voice coming from somewhere deep within the chest. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and I listened. The whisper grew louder, clearer, though the words were still indistinguishable. "Get out." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I looked around, but the attic was empty. The voice had come from the chest. The toys, the dolls, they weren't just toys, they were alive. I hesitated for a moment, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I reached for the lid to close the chest, I felt a strange sensation. The air around me seemed to thicken, like the space was growing heavier, suffocating. I tried to shut the chest, but it wouldn't close. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by a scratching sound, like something clawing at the inside of the chest. I backed away in terror, my eyes fixed on the lid. It was moving on its own, opening slowly as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. Before I could react, the lid flung open completely. And there, among the dolls and toys, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face. A human face, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes staring up at me from inside the chest. I stumbled backward, my knees buckling as I fell to the ground. The face in the chest twisted into a grin, its lips curling up, showing sharp, jagged teeth. The whispering stopped, but the air was thick with a presence, something watching me, waiting. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the room around me seemed to pulse, as if the chest had taken a life of its own. I scrambled to my feet, fear coursing through me. The whispering voice returned, louder now, clearer. "You should have never opened it." I reached for the chest, my fingers trembling as I tried to close it. The lid snapped shut with a force that sent a jolt through my body. But even as I stood there, my heart racing, I knew I hadn't seen the last of it. The chest was waiting. The toys, the dolls, the strange face, they were all waiting. And I knew, deep down, I had only just begun to uncover whatever darkness was hidden inside that forgotten chest. I stood there for a long time, my hands shaking as I stared at the chest. The attic had grown colder. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, and the silence felt suffocating, like the whole house was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air around me was charged with a tension I couldn't explain, and I couldn't get the image of that twisted face out of my mind. I backed away from the chest, my heart pounding, but the whispering began again. This time, it was no longer a soft murmur. It was louder, more insistent, as if the chest itself was calling to me. I wanted to run, to leave the attic and never come back, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chest. "You opened it. Now you're part of it." The voice was unmistakable now. It was clear and sharp, almost as though it were coming from inside my own mind. I stepped back, my body trembling, but the whisper didn't stop. It echoed in my head, louder and more persistent with each passing second. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around, almost expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. The attic remained empty, save for the toys and the chest, which still sat in the corner, waiting. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something odd. The dolls, the ones that had been so still before, had changed positions. They weren't in the same place I had left them. Some were now facing outward, their eyes locked on me. Others were scattered around the chest, as if they had moved on their own. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I had seen the dolls. There was no way they could have moved by themselves. And yet, there they were, positioned in a way that felt deliberate, almost like a message. Arna. I stepped closer to the chest, unable to look away from the dolls. They seemed to be watching me, waiting for something. The whole room felt like it was closing in, as if the walls themselves were pushing against me. My breath was shallow as I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached toward the lid of the chest. I didn't want to open it again, but I felt like I had no choice. I had to know. The moment my fingers brushed against the lid, a sudden sharp noise filled the room. A shrill screech, like nails on a chalkboard. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, until I could barely think over the noise. My ears rang and my vision blurred. I stumbled back, but the screeching didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise ceased. The room fell silent again, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, thick, as if the house itself had become something else entirely. I turned back to the chest. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt wrong. There was a weight to it, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, and then I saw it. The tiny porcelain doll that had been at the top of the pile before was gone. It wasn't in the chest. I searched the room, my eyes scanning the shadows in every corner, but the doll was nowhere to be found. A voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered in my ear, "She's here." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no one. Just the empty attic, the dust, and the forgotten things. The dolls in the chest, now all staring directly at me, seemed to sway slightly, as if they were moving on their own. The feeling in the room grew heavier, more oppressive. Suddenly, the lid of the chest flew open with a violent force, slamming against the wall of the attic, making me jump back in fear. The dolls inside, the ones that had been sitting still, watching me, were now alive, their eyes wide and fixed on me. They were no longer silent. They were whispering, low and unintelligible, as though they were speaking to one another, plotting something. And in the center of them, amidst the toys and scattered pieces, I saw her, the porcelain doll that had disappeared. She was no longer just a doll. She was standing, her tiny feet placed firmly on the bottom of the chest, her head tilted to the side, her eyes dark and knowing. My heart skipped a beat as I took a step back. The doll's gaze shifted to meet mine, and the air seemed to freeze. And then, in the dead silence that followed, it happened. The doll smiled. Not a playful smile, but a twisted one, filled with malice. Her lips stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You're part of us now." The voice was no longer faint. It was loud and clear, coming from the doll, filling the room. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me, wrapping around me like hands, pulling me toward the chest. And just before I could scream, the darkness swallowed me whole. The world around me went dark, the shadows wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural chill, and it felt as though the walls were closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. It was as if my voice had been stolen. I felt myself falling, or maybe I was being pulled, dragged into the very heart of the darkness. The whispering voices surrounded me, their words indistinct, but the malice in their tone was unmistakable. They were all around me, these things. The dolls, the toys, the shadows. They were the ones pulling me under. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I heard the voice again. The doll's voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, and cold. "You belong to us." I tried to fight it. I tried to struggle, to pull myself free, but it was futile. The darkness was in me now, wrapping around my mind, infiltrating my thoughts. The more I resisted, the tighter the grip of the shadows became. I could feel myself slipping, losing control, becoming part of something darker, something ancient. The world around me blurred, fading in and out, until I could no longer tell if I was in the attic or somewhere else entirely. I was trapped between places, between worlds, lost in the suffocating grip of the chest, the dolls, the twisted whispers that had now become a part of my every breath. And then, just when I thought I might lose myself completely, I saw her again. The porcelain doll, standing at the center of the chest, her smile wide, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. She wasn't just a doll anymore, she was alive, and her eyes were looking at me, through me. She was a part of the darkness now, and I could feel her watching me, pulling me closer into her world. "You can't leave," she said, her voice now impossibly close, as though she were speaking directly into my ear. "You are one of us now." The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the doll's face, her smile, stretched wider than it should have been, her teeth sharp and gleaming. And then there was nothing. The attic was quiet once again. The chest lay undisturbed in the corner, empty, as if nothing had ever happened. The dolls were still, their glassy eyes staring at nothing in particular, waiting for the next to come, the next to open the chest. And as the silence stretched on, it was as though the house, the toys, the darkness, were waiting for another soul to claim. 2. There's something unsettling about receiving a letter from a stranger. But when that letter is postmarked from a place you haven't thought about in years, a place tied to memories you've long buried, well, that's when the chill creeps in. It was a Saturday afternoon when I found it, slipped between the pages of an old book I was reading. The envelope yellowed with age, the handwriting unfamiliar. My name was scrawled across the front, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as I reached for it. I hadn't lived in that town for over a decade. My family had left when I was a child, moving halfway across the country. And yet, somehow, someone had tracked me down. I opened the envelope, my fingers trembling. The paper inside was worn, as if it had been handled many times before. The words were typed, each letter precise and deliberate, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I know who you are. I know what happened that summer, and I'm watching. That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just those chilling words, like a message from the past clawing its way back into my life. I sat there, stunned, staring at the letter. My mind raced, trying to place it, trying to make sense of it. Who was this person? The words in the letter were too specific, too pointed. There was no way it could be a coincidence. It had to be someone from my past, someone who knew me, someone who knew what had happened that summer. I shuddered at the thought. I'd tried to forget that summer. It was a time of confusion, of strange happenings that I never fully understood. A time when I saw things that I couldn't explain, things that made me question my own mind. But I had buried it all, locked it away where I thought it couldn't hurt me anymore. And yet, here it was, a reminder, a message from someone who knew. Knew what? I had to find out. I couldn't help myself. I had to go back. Back to the small town where it all began, where the strange events had started, where I had seen things I still couldn't explain. The things that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. The things that, for years, had stayed buried in the recesses of my mind. The next day, I found myself driving back to the place I had left so many years ago. The town hadn't changed much. The same sleepy streets, the same old shops, the same thick, dense woods that bordered the town. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, a place suspended in time. Nothing had changed, nothing, except for the feeling in the air. I parked in front of my old house. It was empty now, a for sale sign in the front yard. The house looked older, more weathered, but the memories still clung to it, like a heavy fog. I stood there for a moment staring at the house when something caught my eye. In the window on the second floor, I saw a shadow. I blinked, but when I looked again, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of unease that was slowly creeping up my spine. I was being ridiculous. There was no shadow. There was no one there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away from the house and walked down the street toward the small park where I used to play as a child. The park was still there, the swings creaking in the wind, the old wooden benches where I had spent countless hours with my friends. But something was different this time. As I walked through the park, I noticed something in the distance, a figure standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was tall, and it was watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I turned around, ready to leave, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, frozen. The figure had disappeared without a trace. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the very park itself had become alive with a dark energy. I didn't know why, but a strange feeling of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. I quickly turned around and walked in the opposite direction, heading back to the main road, trying to shake the feeling that I was being followed. My eyes flicked nervously to the corners of the park, but there was no sign of the figure. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Just as I reached the street, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping for some distraction, but what I saw made my stomach drop. The message was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't be here." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't given anyone my number since I moved away. I didn't recognize the number, and I certainly didn't recognize the voice that had written the message. Was it the same person who had sent the letter? The one who knew about that summer? The one who had been watching me? I stared at the screen, unable to think straight, when the phone buzzed again, a second message from the same number. "I know what you did. Come to the old bridge. I'll be waiting." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The old bridge? I hadn't thought about it in years. It was the place where it all happened, the place that I had tried so hard to forget, the place where everything had changed. I had to go. I didn't want to. I wanted to turn around and drive away, forget everything, pretend it was just some sick prank. But something inside me, something deep in my gut, told me I had no choice. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. The old bridge was located just outside of town, hidden deep in the woods. It was a place that had always felt eerie to me, even as a child. The bridge was ancient, the wooden planks warped and weathered by time. There was something about it, the way it creaked in the wind, the way the trees around it seemed to grow unnaturally tall, like they were watching, like they were waiting. I took a deep breath and drove down the winding road toward the woods, the headlights of my car cutting through the dark. As I approached the bridge, I slowed down, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my heart racing. I parked my car at the side of the road, just before the trees opened up to the bridge. I hesitated. I could see the bridge ahead, its silhouette outlined by the moonlight. There was no one there, no figure waiting for me, no sign of life at all. It was quiet, too quiet, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the bridge. The wooden planks groaned under my feet, and the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me. I could feel it now, the unease, the sense of something wrong lingering in the air. The shadows seemed to stretch out before me, darker than they should have been. I reached the middle of the bridge and stopped. The cold air pressed against me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was no one here, no figure standing in the distance like I had imagined. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. No movement, just the sound of the wind. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. The same voice that had written the messages, the same voice that had haunted my thoughts. "It's time to remember." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice came from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Time to remember what happened. I turned back to the bridge, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. My eyes were drawn to the far end of the bridge, where the shadows seemed to shift and sway in unnatural ways. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the bridge, just barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately, it started to walk toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and my body froze. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, But there was something familiar about the way it moved, the way it watched me. My heart raced as I realized who it was. It was me, not exactly, not completely, but it was a version of me, a twisted, distorted version, its face half hidden in shadow, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling familiarity. And then the whisper came again, clearer now, louder. You knew it was always going to end like this. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was getting closer, each step heavy and deliberate, its silhouette slowly becoming more defined in the dim light. The closer it came, the more the air seemed to grow thick and suffocating. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My body was paralyzed, as though I had stepped into a nightmare, one that I couldn't escape. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, standing still in the middle of the bridge, its eyes locked onto mine. The same eyes. My eyes. But they weren't mine. They were darker, colder, as though something had taken hold of them, something that wasn't human. A grin spread across the figure's face, but it wasn't a smile. It was twisted, grotesque, as if it were mocking me, daring me to acknowledge the truth. You knew, it whispered, its voice now a low, rasping growl. You knew the truth. You knew this day would come. My breath caught in my throat, and a sickening realization began to dawn on me. This wasn't just some stranger. It wasn't a hallucination or a trick of my mind. It was me, or at least it was a part of me. A part of something I had buried long ago. A part of my past that I had tried to forget. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnervingly slow, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to turn and run, to escape. But my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. You can't run from it, the figure continued, its voice now like a rasping whisper, sending a chill down my spine. It's always been here, watching, waiting. I finally found my voice, trembling with fear as I opened my mouth to speak. Who are you? The figure's grin widened, and for a moment I could see its face more clearly. My face, but twisted, distorted, as though something had molded it into something unrecognizable. I am you, it said softly, its voice sending a ripple of terror through me. The you that you buried, the you that you've tried to forget. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. But deep down, I knew it was. I knew that whatever had happened all those years ago, whatever had been buried in my past, was now coming to claim me, to claim the truth. The figure stepped closer, its face now inches from mine, its eyes burning into mine with a terrifying intensity. You can't escape it. You never could. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the shadows on the bridge seemed to stretch and twist, enveloping the figure and me. The world around us began to blur, the edges of reality warping and shifting like something was tearing through the fabric of time. And then, in a flash, everything stopped. The wind died down, the shadows receded, the figure was gone. I was alone. But the feeling didn't fade. The sense of dread, the suffocating weight of knowing something dark was lingering just beyond my reach. It was still there. I looked around the bridge, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was no sign of the figure. The bridge was empty, quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew that the figure was still there, waiting for me, watching from the shadows, and I knew that whatever happened that summer, whatever I had done, it was far from over. As I turned to leave the bridge, I glanced at the spot where the figure had been standing, and there, in the dirt, was a single footprint. Too big to be mine, too deep to have been made by anyone else. And beside it, barely visible in the fading light, was the word scrawled in the dirt. Remember. 3. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, slipped into my mailbox with no return address, no stamp, nothing to indicate where it had come from. It was thick, the kind of paper that felt old but solid, its edges worn slightly as though it had been handled many times before. I stared at it for a long moment, my curiosity slowly growing into unease. Who would send me a letter like this? I almost tossed it aside, convinced it was just some kind of spam or misdelivery, but something about it nagged at me. It felt wrong. So I brought it inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and carefully broke the seal. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink dark and flowing, each word perfectly formed in a neat, almost obsessive way. But it was the content that sent a shiver through me. You don't remember me, but I remember you. We met long ago. I've been watching you, waiting. It's time for you to come back to where you belong. I'll be waiting. I reread the message, a cold feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. Oh, there was no signature, no hint of who had written it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the message seemed so personal, as if this person knew me intimately. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We met long ago. That phrase stuck with me. The last time I could remember receiving a letter like this, so cryptic, so strange, was years ago when I was a child. But there was no way it could be connected. I had moved across the country, left my old life, my childhood behind. There was no reason for anyone to send me a letter now. No one had any reason to remember me, at least not like this. I tossed the letter aside, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. But it lingered, gnawing at me, twisting in my mind. The words wouldn't leave me. I glanced at the envelope again, half expecting to find a clue, a piece of something that would make sense of it all. But there was nothing. Just the plain, unmarked envelope and the chilling message. I couldn't let it go. I needed to know. I grabbed the letter once more, my fingers trembling, and reread it again. The more I read it, the more it felt like a puzzle I had to solve, a mystery I couldn't leave unsolved. But as I read, another thought crept into my mind. Who would know me well enough to send such a letter? I tried to shake the feeling, to tell myself it was nothing, but the sense of being watched, of something unseen, lurking just out of sight, kept growing stronger. The feeling was so overwhelming that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone had been keeping track of me. Someone had been waiting. That evening, I couldn't shake the need to investigate, to find some clue, anything that would explain this strange letter. I found myself standing in front of my childhood home, the place I had left behind so many years ago. The house looked the same as it always had, though now it seemed older, quieter, more forlorn. I had to know if there was something more to this letter, something I had missed all those years ago. The house felt like a relic now, a place where memories lived, long buried beneath the years. I walked around the back to where I knew the old shed used to be, the one I had spent so many hours playing in, hiding away from the world. It was still there, covered in ivy and overgrown with weeds, but still standing. I had never thought much about it before, but tonight there was something different about it, something that made my heart beat faster. I pushed the door open, and the musty smell of old wood and forgotten things hit me. Inside, everything was as I remembered. Old boxes, tools, forgotten toys from childhood, all tucked away in dark corners. But something was different now. The shadows seemed deeper, thicker. The air felt colder. I walked in cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand, scanning the room. And then, at the far corner, something caught my eye. A box. It wasn't one I remembered. It was new, with a piece of old string tied around it just like it had been waiting for me to come back. My pulse quickened as I moved toward the box. I knelt down and untied the string, my hands trembling. When I opened it, I couldn't believe what I saw. A photo. A faded, yellowed photograph of a group of children playing in the yard. I recognized one of them immediately. It was me, from a time I had long forgotten. But there was someone else in the photo, someone I didn't remember. A tall figure stood in the background, partially obscured by the shadows, but enough for me to see the face clearly. It was someone I had never seen before, someone I had no memory of. Yet, somehow, I knew it was the same person who had sent me the letter. The feeling of dread overwhelmed me as I stared at the photo, at the face that seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to remember. And then, the phone rang. The phone rang again, slicing through the silence like a knife. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to answer it. The photo still lay in my hands, its image seared into my mind. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the face in the photograph, the face of someone I had never seen before, yet somehow knew intimately. The phone continued to ring, louder now, more insistent. With trembling hands, I finally picked it up. "Hello?" My voice sounded distant, barely my own, as I held the receiver to my ear. There was a long pause, just silence on the other end. My breath quickened. Then, slowly, a voice, low and unfamiliar, spoke. "You remember me now, don't you?" The voice was calm, but there was a chilling edge to it. It was almost like it was waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to respond in some way. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. My mind was racing. The letter, the photograph, the figure in the shadows. It was all too much to take in. My mouth went dry, and I could barely hear my own thoughts over the pounding of my heart. "I know you do," the voice continued, its tone softening. "We were friends once." Something about that made my stomach twist. Friends? I didn't remember any of it. I tried to think, tried to piece together the fragments of my childhood, but there was nothing. No memories, no connection. But the voice, there was something about it that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was too familiar. And the words it spoke felt like they were meant for me. It was like they were calling me back to something I had long forgotten. The voice spoke again, this time a little more urgent. "I'm not going to wait forever." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what else to say. The words felt inadequate, almost pointless. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. The line went silent for a long moment, and when the voice finally spoke again, it was softer, almost soothing. "It's time. You have to come back to where we first met. I'll be waiting." And then, without another word, the line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, staring at the receiver in disbelief. The room felt colder now, as though the very air around me had changed, thickened. My fingers slowly released the phone, and I stood frozen, the photograph still clutched in my hand. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the silence in the room unbearable. Where did they want me to go? I hadn't even thought to ask, but I knew. The feeling in my gut told me all I needed to know. I had to go back to where it all began. My feet carried me almost on their own. I couldn't stop myself. My legs moved as though I had no control over them, as though something else had taken hold. The photograph, the voice, it all felt like a pull, an irresistible force dragging me toward the place I thought I'd escaped. The old house where my childhood had taken place, the memories I had buried, the friends I had forgotten, they were all waiting for me. I drove in a daze, the darkness pressing in around me as I made my way through the familiar streets, past houses that hadn't changed in years. The town hadn't changed. It was all the same. But I wasn't the same. I pulled up to the house and sat there for a moment, staring at it. It looked abandoned, worn, almost like a ghost of what it once had been. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. It was eerie, silent. I got out of the car and slowly walked toward the front door, my breath shallow, each step heavy with dread. I had no choice now. I had to face what I had left behind. I reached the door and paused, my hand hovering over the knob. My heart raced. Something inside me screamed to turn around, to leave, but the pull was too strong. I opened the door. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and forgotten memories. The furniture was gone, but the walls were covered with old photographs, all of them showing children from my past. Children I didn't remember, except for one photo. The figure in the corner of the photo was the same. The one I had seen in the photograph from the letter. The same face, the same eyes. It was me. The door slammed shut behind me, and the house groaned, as if coming to life, reacting to my presence. I heard the whisper again, louder now, coming from the shadows in the corners. You remembered. And then the house fell silent. But I knew. I knew that the house, the memories, the person who had written the letter, they had been waiting for me all along. It was a quiet afternoon when I found it, buried deep in the attic under piles of old books, forgotten boxes, and mementos that I had long since stopped caring about. The family album. My mother's prized possession, passed down from my grandmother, filled with photographs of relatives I had never met. Faces frozen in time, smiles from a different era. I had always been fascinated by it as a child. My mother would sit me down in front of the album and tell me stories of the people in the pictures, my great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, family friends. She would point to faces in the photos, sharing stories of their lives, their adventures, and their misfortunes. But as I got older, the album was left forgotten on the shelf. And it wasn't until that day, after my mother had passed away, that I decided to revisit it, to see those faces once more, to remember the stories, even if they were no longer shared aloud. I pulled the album from beneath the dust-covered pile, the leather binding cracked with age. The cover, a rich mahogany hue, seemed to shine dimly in the light as I opened it. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air, and the weight of nostalgia pressed down on me. I flipped through the pages slowly, my fingers grazing over the faded edges of the photographs. Each one was a glimpse into a past I barely remembered. Grandparents I had never known, uncles and aunts who had passed long before I was born, distant relatives whose names I had only heard in passing. They all seemed so far away, so untouchable. But then I came across something that made me stop. It was a photograph of a family gathering at my grandmother's house. Everyone was there, my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, but there was one person I didn't recognize. A man, standing at the back of the group, his face half hidden in shadow, as if he didn't belong. His presence was odd, out of place. The other faces were so familiar, but he was different. I stared at the photo, my eyes tracing the unfamiliar face. It wasn't like I hadn't seen this picture before. No, I had. It was one of those photos my mother had often pointed to when telling stories. But I had never noticed him before. Who was he? I turned the page, hoping to find more context, but the next page was just as confusing. Another photo, another gathering. And once again, there he was. The same man, standing in the same spot. barely visible in the corner of the frame. My stomach tightened. How had I missed him before? Why hadn't I noticed him in any of the family stories? My mind raced, trying to remember if my mother had ever mentioned him. She hadn't, I was sure of it. I flipped through more pages, my fingers trembling as I scanned each photograph. There were more photos with the same man, each one showing him at family gatherings, lurking in the background, never the focal point. He was always there, yet never mentioned. The unease in my stomach deepened as I turned each page, desperate to find an explanation, to find a name. And then I found it. At the very end of the album, tucked between the last few pages, there was a photo I had never seen before. It was different from the others. This one was a portrait, taken in the 1940s, black and white, with the man standing in the center. There was no shadow to obscure his face this time. He was smiling, but it was a strange smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. And beside him, standing in the foreground, was my grandmother. They were standing so close together, too close. I froze. My grandmother, with this man. But my grandmother had never mentioned him. I had never heard her speak of anyone who looked like him. Who was he? Why was he in these pictures? The photograph felt wrong. Something about it didn't sit right with me. It was as though it had been placed there on purpose, placed there for me to find. I turned the photo over, and my breath caught in my throat. Written on the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, were 2 words: Henry Blackwell. I had never heard that name before. Henry Blackwell. I grabbed my phone, almost instinctively, and searched for the name. But nothing came up. No obituary, no mention in any family history, no record. It was as if he had never existed. How could that be? How could my grandmother have kept such a secret? And then, as if to confirm my growing sense of dread, I received a notification on my phone. An unknown number had sent me a message. It read, "The truth is closer than you think." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. And before I could react, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from the same unknown number. "I'll be waiting at the old house. Come find me." The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. I had to go back. I stared at the phone in my hand, the message blinking back at me from the screen. My heart was pounding in my chest as I read the words again. "I'll be waiting at the old house. Come find me." The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. I had to go back. I stared at the phone in my hand, the message blinking back at me from the screen. My heart was pounding in my chest as I read the words again. "I'll be waiting at the old house. Come find me." The old house. The place where my grandmother had lived. The place where so many of my childhood memories had been formed. I had left it behind long ago, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. Whoever this person was, they knew something, something I had forgotten, something tied to that house, to my family, to him, Henry Blackwell. The name repeated in my mind like an echo I couldn't escape. Who was he? Why had my grandmother kept him a secret? And why was he still waiting for me? I didn't want to go. Every part of me screamed to leave it all behind, to forget this strange man and his cryptic messages. But something, an insistent pull, a strange curiosity, drove me toward the house. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew that I couldn't turn away. The drive felt longer than it should have, as if the world around me was stretching, pulling time itself into some warped, unfamiliar rhythm. I could almost feel the weight of the air around me, thick with questions I couldn't answer. The roads seemed to twist and wend as I made my way toward the old house. and the trees lining the path seemed to grow taller, darker. When I finally reached the house, it looked just as it always had. Old, abandoned, neglected, but somehow still standing, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, but I couldn't turn back now. I stepped inside. The house was silent, too silent. It was as if it had been frozen in time, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, amplified in the quiet. I felt as though the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I moved through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The familiar scent of dust and old wood filled my nostrils, but it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, as I reached the hallway, I saw it. A photograph. The same photograph I had seen in the album. The one with my grandmother and Henry Blackwell standing together, smiling that strange smile. But this time, it was framed on the wall, placed in the very spot where my grandmother's pictures had once hung. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The photo was no longer just a piece of history. It was a sign, a message. And as I stood there, staring at it, the air around me shifted. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, darker. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I could feel it. The presence. It was him. Henry Blackwell. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the walls closing in. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it. Soft at first, like a whisper, but growing louder. A voice. Familiar. Cold. You shouldn't have come. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, Henry Blackwell's face appeared. It wasn't a ghostly image. It wasn't some apparition. It was real, standing there in the reflection as clear as day. His eyes locked onto mine. The same eyes I had seen in the photograph. The same face that had been haunting my memories. And then, his lips curled into that twisted smile. The same smile. You remember now, don't you? He said, his voice echoing through the empty house, sending a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, he vanished from the mirror. The reflection went dark, leaving me standing there, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. And then, a voice came again. This time, not from the mirror, but from behind me. It's too late to turn back now. I turned around, but there was no one there. The house was still silent. And then, it hit me. The door I had entered through. It was gone. The hallway stretched on endlessly, and I couldn't see the exit anymore. I was trapped in this house, with Henry Blackwell and the truth I had been running from. I knew I had to face it. I walked forward, deeper into the house, knowing I was walking towards something I could no longer deny. And as I moved through the darkened rooms, I heard one final whisper, the words hanging in the air like a cold promise. Welcome home. 5. It started with a message. Just a simple text at first, nothing extraordinary. But the sender, someone I hadn't heard from in years, was what made the chill run through my spine. The message read, I know you're here. Come find me. I didn't recognize the number, but the name attached to it was one I hadn't thought about in ages. Marcus Holloway. Marcus had been my childhood friend. We were inseparable back in the small town we grew up in, running through the woods behind our houses, sneaking into the old abandoned mansion at the edge of town, playing games only the two of us understood. But then, one day, Marcus just disappeared. vanished without a trace. His family moved away and no one ever spoke of him again. I had tried to forget him, to move on. But now, receiving that message, it felt like a ghost was pulling me back into something I thought was long buried. I stared at the text for a long time. My fingers hovered over the keys, unsure if I should reply, but before I could decide, my phone buzzed again. "You remember the mansion. You remember us." The words were a shock, pulling me into a memory I didn't want to face. That mansion, it had always been strange. Old, crumbling, locked away from the world as though it was keeping its secrets. We had spent hours there as kids, sneaking around its dusty rooms, exploring its dark corners. There was always a sense that the mansion was more than just an abandoned building. It felt like something was watching us from inside it, something that lived within its walls. But I never thought I'd hear about it again. The air in my apartment grew cold as I read the text again, my thoughts racing. How did Marcus know where I was? How could he have contacted me after all this time? Was this some kind of sick joke, or was something darker at play? I grabbed my jacket, not thinking twice. I had to know. I had to find out what had happened to Marcus. I couldn't let this go. As I drove toward the mansion, the unease in my stomach only deepened. The road leading out of town was long and winding, cutting through thick woods, trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. The sun had already begun to set, casting the landscape in shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. It was a familiar route, one I had traveled many times before, but tonight it felt different. Darker, more foreboding. When I finally reached the mansion, the sight of it made my heart stop. It hadn't changed at all. The same old, decaying structure stood there, its windows dark and empty, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. The iron gate that had once been locked was now wide open, and the path leading up to the door seemed to beckon me, the overgrown grass whispering beneath my feet. I hesitated. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, and a part of me told me to turn around, to leave before it was too late. But another part of me, one that hadn't forgotten Marcus, urged me forward. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, and pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The house was as cold as ever, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. But as I stepped further inside, I felt something else. Presence. Something watching me. The floorboards beneath me creaked, but there was no one there. I moved through the dark halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It felt like time had stood still here, like the mansion itself had frozen in place, waiting. I could hear nothing but the beating of my own heart, the weight of the air pressing in on me with every step. And then I saw it. In the hallway, at the far end, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, I saw it more clearly. It was a figure, standing still, its features obscured in the darkness. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same shape, the same silhouette. I could feel my pulse quicken as the figure stepped out of the shadows, and my stomach dropped when I saw who it was. It was Marcus. He looked different. Older, more worn, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't place. But it was him. I knew it in my bones. His lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but then, just as quickly, he vanished, like a wisp of smoke, slipping back into the darkness from where he had emerged. My breath was coming in short gasps as I stepped forward, the chill in the air growing thicker. I could feel the weight of his presence, still lingering, just beyond my reach. I moved faster now, desperate to find him, to understand what was happening. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, and the shadows stretching longer, like fingers reaching for me. As I rounded the corner, I saw something on the floor. A message, scrawled in what looked like chalk or dust. "You've found me, but now you'll never leave." I stood there, staring at the words on the floor, my mind racing. "You've found me, but now you'll never leave." The cold chill that had settled in my bones deepened, and I felt my stomach twist. The words seemed to crawl across the floor, as if they were alive, following me, chasing me. The house groaned around me, its old walls creaking and shifting as though it was waking from a long slumber. Marcos was here, I had no doubt about it. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The shadows in the house seemed to pulse, stretching and swirling like they had a life of their own. I had to find him. I had to know what was going on, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. The air was thick, suffocating. I started to walk again, my steps hesitant, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The hall stretched on, the darkness pushing against me, making everything feel disjointed, out of place. The mansion felt alive, watching me, pressing in. Then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze brushing past me, but it grew clearer, louder. My name. "Come closer." The voice was soft, but it was unmistakably Marcus's. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, the whisper guiding me. It led me to a door at the end of the hall, a door I had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the faint light flickering from inside. The whisper grew more insistent. "I'm waiting. Come inside." With a mixture of fear and determination, I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by a single candle burning in the corner, its light flickering in the windless air. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in sheets, and dust layered thick over everything. But there was something else, something that made the room feel wrong. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was cracked, the glass cloudy, but the reflection was still visible. Too visible. I saw my own face staring back at me, but there was something in the reflection that made my stomach lurch. Behind me in the mirror, I saw a shadow. A figure, tall and indistinct, just standing there, watching. I spun around quickly, but the room was empty. There was no one behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its outline clearer now, like it was moving closer. I backed away, my feet stumbling, and the whisper came again, this time from the mirror itself. "You've been looking for me. Now, we can be together again." I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the floor. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. The figure behind me was closer now. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a face I knew, a face I hadn't seen in years. It was Marcus. But his eyes were hollow, empty, and his smile was twisted, wrong. His lips parted, and the whispering voice filled the room again, louder this time. "I never left. I've been waiting for you. You don't remember, but you will. Come closer, it's time." I stepped back, my heart racing. I knew I had to leave, that I was in too deep, that something was terribly wrong. But as I turned toward the door to escape, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was approaching. I turned, and there he was. Marcus. But this time, he was standing in front of me, not in the mirror, not in the reflection. He was here, in the room, his form solid, his eyes wide and unblinking. His smile stretched too far across his face, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and dripping with something darker. "Now you're mine." The room seemed to tilt around me, and I staggered back, my head spinning. The walls were closing in, the air pressing against me. Marcus took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine, his smile never fading. "You remember now, don't you? You were always meant to be here with me. We're connected." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I was caught in some nightmare I couldn't escape. The whispering grew louder again, this time coming from all around me. "You've always belonged here. Now, you will never leave." I felt the ground beneath my feet give way, and everything spun. My vision blurred as the shadows in the room reached out toward me, wrapping around my body, pulling me into their cold embrace. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I couldn't breathe. The world around me faded into darkness, and I felt myself being dragged under, deeper and deeper into the house's cold heart. The darkness enveloped me completely, suffocating and thick, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows twisted around me, pulling me deeper into the abyss, and all the while, that voice, the voice of Marcus, echoed through the blackness, its words seeping into my very soul. "You're mine now." It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a truth I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body had no strength left. The darkness was too overwhelming, the pull too strong. I felt as though I was being consumed, erased from existence, swallowed by something ancient and forgotten. Then, just when I thought I would lose myself completely, I felt a sharp tug, as if I were being pulled back into the light. My body jolted awake, if it could even be called awake. The world around me was still dark, but now I was lying on the cold floor of the room. My arms and legs felt heavy, unresponsive. I looked up, and there he was again, Marcus. But this time his figure seemed different. His face was no longer twisted with that cruel smile. It was a blank slate. His eyes, once hollow and empty, were now filled with something darker, a void. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, his voice no longer the familiar one I had known, but something distorted, alien, like it had been borrowed from something far older, something not human. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. I could only lie there, helpless, as the shadows closed in around me, consuming everything. The room, the mansion, everything began to shift and distort. The walls, once solid and familiar, were now warped and bending. The floor cracked open like the earth itself was coming undone. I wanted to run, wanted to fight, but all I could do was stare, paralyzed by the sight of Marcus as he slowly walked toward me, his eyes locked onto mine. We never left. With a final, slow step forward, his hand reached out, and just as it touched my forehead, everything went black. I never liked trains. There was something about the constant rumble beneath your feet, the rhythmic sound of the wheels against the tracks, that made everything feel too far from reality. I usually preferred to drive, but that night, after a particularly grueling week, I decided to take the midnight train back home. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful journey, a simple escape from my stress. I had no idea, as I boarded the train at the quiet station, that this would be anything but a peaceful ride. The train was nearly empty, save for a few tired travelers scattered throughout the car. The air inside was stale, and the lights flickered faintly as I found my seat by the window. I put my bag on the empty seat next to me, and I sank into the worn, padded seat, letting out a quiet sigh. Outside, the world passed by in a blur, dark fields, trees, and the occasional sign marking small towns. My eyes grew heavy, and I was almost drifting off when something caught my attention. A figure entered the car. At first, I didn't think much of it. Trains were always full of strange passengers, and this one seemed no different. The man was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He walked slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet car. I watched as he made his way down the aisle, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though he was a part of the train itself. But there was something off about him. His presence felt like a shadow in the dim light. It wasn't just his strange, slow gait, it was the way he didn't look at anyone. His eyes hidden behind the brim of his hat, and his face completely unreadable. He took a seat across from me, the one directly across the aisle, and I couldn't help but watch him. Something about him drew me in, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. He didn't move, didn't take out a book or phone like the other passengers. He simply sat there, still and silent, staring out the window. I looked away, trying to ignore the strange unease settling in my stomach. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as the minutes ticked by, I found myself glancing back at him more and more often, unable to stop. Finally, I decided to close my eyes, hoping to shake the feeling that had settled over me. I leaned my head against the window, feeling the cold glass against my cheek. But before I could even close my eyes completely, I heard a soft sound. A whisper, faint but clear. "You're not supposed to be here." The words sent a jolt through me, and I snapped my eyes open. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. The train was still moving steadily, the usual sounds of the tracks beneath us. But I could feel it. Something had shifted in the air. I turned my gaze toward the man again, my breath caught in my throat. He hadn't moved. His face was still hidden, but the strange sense of unease grew stronger. I looked away quickly, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The train's lights flickered once more, casting the entire car in an eerie glow. And then I heard it again. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice whispered, this time louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. It was coming from the man across from me. His lips hadn't moved, but I heard his voice as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands clenched into fists in my lap. There was no one else in the car. No one else had heard him speak. I was certain of it. So why was he talking to me? I should have said something. I should have asked him who he was, or what he meant, but I couldn't. The words caught in my throat. I could only sit there, staring at him, as he remained perfectly still, his hat covering his face. The train continued to rumble down the tracks, but the atmosphere in the car had shifted completely. It felt like we were in a different place now. Like the train wasn't just moving through space, it was moving through time, through something else. The air was colder, and the rhythmic sounds of the tracks seemed to echo differently, as though they were coming from somewhere far away. Suddenly, the man across from me shifted slightly in his seat. My breath caught as I realized his eyes were no longer hidden by his hat. They were wide open, dark, empty, and staring directly at me. And then, in a voice that was no longer a whisper, but a sharp, clear tone, he said, "You don't belong here, not anymore." His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. "You don't belong here, not anymore." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His gaze was unnervingly intense, those dark eyes boring into mine like he could see into my very soul. I felt frozen in place, unable to speak or move, my heart pounding in my chest. The train seemed to be picking up speed, the vibrations beneath me intensifying. The sound of the tracks clicking underneath us grew louder, more insistent, but there was something else now, something strange. A low hum, like a pulse, vibrating through the air, growing stronger with each passing second. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the man. He hadn't blinked once. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his clothes seemed to be made from some fabric that didn't quite fit the modern world. He looked like a relic from another time. Someone who didn't belong on this train. Someone who didn't belong at all. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice shaky. The man didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at me, as if weighing my question. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. His voice even softer now, almost a breath. "I was once a passenger just like you." His words struck me like a thunderclap. What did he mean by that? I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but something in me had to ask. "What do you mean, a passenger?" The man shifted slightly in his seat, his movements slow, deliberate. There was an unnatural calm to him, like he was detached from the world around him. He tilted his head, his eyes never leaving mine. "We're all passengers, in one way or another." I felt a chill spread through my body as his words sank in. The train seemed to have slowed down, and I glanced nervously out the window, expecting to see the passing lights of the city. But there was nothing. No buildings, no lights, nothing but the endless stretch of dark, empty land. I glanced back at the man. His face had changed. Not physically, but in the way his presence seemed to warp reality around him. The edges of the cabin had grown blurry, like a bad painting. The train itself felt distant, unreal, as though we weren't truly moving forward anymore. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice now trembling. For the first time, the man smiled. It was a thin, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't want anything from you. You're the one who asked to be here." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but it wasn't making sense. I had taken the midnight train because I needed a break, a change. I never asked for any of this. I didn't want to be trapped on this train with this man who seemed to be speaking in riddles. The train's lights flickered above us, casting the cabin into darkness for a brief moment before returning, though the dim glow seemed faint now, as if the power was failing. I shivered, my mind racing. "You didn't ask for it, but you're here now," the man said, his voice now so soft that it felt like it was seeping into my skin. "And when the train stops, you won't leave the same way you got on." My pulse quickened as he spoke. I didn't know what he meant, but I was beginning to fear that I didn't want to find out. Something was terribly wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension, as though the entire cabin was closing in around me. I stood up suddenly, my legs unsteady. I had to get out of here, had to find a way to escape, but the aisle felt endless. The train car stretched on farther than it should have. There was no end to it, just darkness and the sound of the tracks. I looked back at the man, but he wasn't sitting in his seat anymore. The seat was empty. I glanced around the cabin, frantic, my breath coming in short gasps. Where had he gone? And then I heard it. A faint sound, a whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the train, but it was unmistakable. "Turn around." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper had come from directly behind me. I slowly turned, my heart pounding, and my breath caught in my throat. There he was. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide open now, black as coal, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The man wasn't standing anymore. He was floating, inches off the ground, his body swaying slightly in the air, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You shouldn't have looked away," he whispered. His voice was distorted, now more than a whisper, more like a chorus of voices, layered and unrecognizable. "Now, you're part of this ride." I stumbled back, my mind racing, but the train had stopped. The door to the next car was just a few feet away, and I reached for it, but something held me back. The train had stopped, but not at a station. It was on the tracks, surrounded by complete darkness. And there, standing at the door between the cars, was another figure. This one looked even more unfamiliar than the last. It was a reflection of myself. I froze, my hand still grasping the cold metal of the door. The figure standing at the entrance between the cars was a perfect reflection of me. It was me, but not. Its features were too sharp, too cold, like someone had taken a familiar face and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The figure's eyes, my eyes, were hollow, dark, and empty, like black holes that had swallowed any trace of humanity. It grinned at me, but it wasn't the same smile. It was twisted, malicious, as if it knew something I didn't. "I've been waiting for you," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I could feel my breath catch, my mind struggling to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before me. The train was silent now, the tracks no longer humming beneath us, and the air felt colder than ever. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling with terror. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, as though it didn't belong in the world I knew. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The room around me felt distant, like I was no longer in the train car at all. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of the tracks outside, but the sound felt disconnected, as though I was hearing it from another world. The figure's grin widened as it moved closer, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, as it reached out a cold hand, it whispered, "You can never leave." In that moment, I realized what was happening. I was trapped on this train with no way out. The man who had spoken to me earlier, the one whose presence had seemed so wrong, had been right all along. This train wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a prison, a place where passengers were never meant to leave. I wanted to fight, to break free, but the reflection of myself stood before me, blocking my path, its smile now stretching unnaturally wide, as if to consume everything. I closed my eyes, hoping for the nightmare to end. But when I opened them again, the train was gone. The tracks, the cars, the figure, they had all vanished. There was nothing left but darkness. And then, in that darkness, I heard the whisper again, this time, not from the reflection, but from all around me. "Welcome to the midnight train." It was supposed to be just another night at the diner. The kind of night where nothing extraordinary happens, where everything runs smoothly, and the world outside feels distant, like it belongs in a different time. I had worked at Marty's Diner for almost 2 years, long enough to know the regulars, the routines, and the smell of the greasy fries that filled the air every night. It was a simple life, nothing too complicated, just a steady paycheck and the usual hum of conversation around me. But then, that night, something changed. It started like any other evening shift. I clocked in at 5 p.m., tied my apron around my waist, and slid into my station near the counter. The diner was busy, the smell of coffee and eggs in the air, and the low murmur of a conversation and clinking silverware creating a comfortable backdrop to the usual routine. I had just started taking orders when I noticed him. A dog. He was standing outside the diner, his fur matted, his eyes wide and wild, staring at me through the window. His paws were caked in dirt, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. But what caught my attention wasn't his appearance. It was the way he looked at me. There was something in his eyes, a pleading, almost desperate look that made my chest tighten. I tried to shake it off. It was a stray dog, after all. There were plenty of them around the diner, always lurking around the alley, hoping for a scrap of food. But something about this one was different. He seemed out of place. His eyes followed me as I moved through the diner, never leaving my gaze. I went about my work, serving the usual plates of eggs, burgers, and milkshakes to the customers. But every time I glanced out the window, the dog was still there, standing motionless, watching me. Eventually, the dinner rush slowed down, and I had a moment to catch my breath. As I wiped down the counter, I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up to see the dog walking into the diner, his head low, his tail tucked between his legs. A gasp escaped my lips before I could stop it. The dog was inside. I quickly looked over at Marty, the diner's owner, but he didn't seem to notice. He was busy chatting with a customer at the back booth. The dog padded over to the counter, his dirty paws leaving faint prints on the clean floor. I froze, not sure what to do. Should I shoo him out? Should I call animal control, or should I help him? But the moment I looked into the dog's eyes again, the same pleading expression, something inside me snapped. I couldn't just turn him away, not when he looked like that. I reached under the counter for a bowl of water, unsure if I was making the right choice, but knowing I couldn't do nothing. I placed the bowl in front of the dog, and he immediately lapped up the water, his eyes never leaving me. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt stirring in my chest. I should have done something sooner. As the dog drank, I turned around to check on the rest of the diner. But when I turned back, the dog was gone, just like that. No sound, no sign. He had vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it. How had he gotten out so quietly? Where did he go? I shook my head, trying to push away the feeling that something strange had just happened. I continued my shift, but the odd feeling didn't leave me. The diner felt wrong somehow, like I was waiting for something, anything to happen. It was an hour before closing time when I saw it. Another message written on the wall in the same handwriting. "I'll be waiting for you." I stood there, staring at the message, my heart racing. It was written in the same chalky handwriting, the letters large and sloppy as if they had been hurriedly scrawled across the wall. "I'll be waiting for you." My eyes darted around the diner, looking for anything out of place. No one seemed to notice. The few customers who remained in their booths were engrossed in their conversations, the clinking of cutlery and the soft hum of the jukebox filling the air. But all I could hear, all I could think of, was that message. I glanced at the kitchen door, my breath shallow. Could someone have written it while I wasn't looking? But no, I was certain I had been alone in here. Marty was still in the back, chatting with a regular, and I hadn't seen anyone approach the wall. The thought sent a chill down my spine. The dog. It had to be the dog. There was no other explanation. I remembered his eyes, pleading, desperate. But what did the message mean? Who had left it and why? I shook my head. It didn't make sense. I was imagining things, seeing patterns that weren't there. I was just tired, that's all. Maybe the stress from the long shift was catching up with me. But just as I turned to head back to the counter, I heard something. A soft scratch against the door, followed by a low whine. I froze. I knew who it was. The dog. With a sigh of disbelief, I walked over to the door and peered out the small window. The dog was standing outside, staring at me with those same wide, dark eyes. But this time, there was something new, something wrong. He wasn't just standing there anymore. The dog was waiting. Waiting in the exact same spot as before, only now, it seemed as though he was holding something in his mouth. My heart skipped a beat. What could he possibly have? I stepped back from the window, unsure of what to do. Something felt off. This wasn't just some stray dog looking for food. No, this was different. But before I could gather my thoughts, I heard the bell above the door chime once again. The dog had entered. I turned in shock. There he was, standing just inside the door, his eyes locked onto mine, a small object clutched gently in his mouth. My breath caught in my throat as I looked down at the object. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I took a step forward, slowly reaching out to take it from his mouth, my hands trembling. As soon as I touched it, the dog backed away, his gaze never leaving me. I unfolded the paper, my heart hammering in my chest. What was it now? The message was brief, just a few words written in the same handwriting, but they made my blood run cold. "You're the next one. Don't run." The words burned into my mind, and my legs suddenly felt weak. I tried to breathe, to focus, but the room around me seemed to blur. The dog was watching me, waiting, his eyes full of an eerie intelligence. I could feel it now, the sense that something wasn't just wrong, it was coming for me. I looked around the diner once more, half expecting the walls to close in. The last few hours had felt like a fever dream, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't escape this feeling. The dog, the messages, they weren't just coincidence, they were connected. But how? Suddenly, I heard the voice. It was faint, like a whisper in the air, but it was unmistakable. "Don't worry, you're not alone." I spun around, but the diner was empty. Just the soft murmur of the jukebox and the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. The mirror behind the counter. It wasn't reflecting the room like it should have been. Instead, it showed the reflection of the dog standing beside me. His eyes wide, but his form was distorted, twisted. It was as if something was pulling at the very fabric of his shape, stretching and distorting it beyond recognition. I blinked, trying to focus, but the image didn't change. The dog wasn't standing beside me anymore. He was behind me, staring at my reflection. Only now, he was smiling. And as if on cue, the bell above the door chimed once more. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like jelly, and my heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst from my chest. The dog's reflection, no, it wasn't just a reflection anymore, was staring at me, grinning in that twisted way. The room felt colder, the shadows longer, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. His smile grew wider, the distortion in his form becoming more pronounced, as if reality itself was bending to his will. And then, I heard it. A low growl, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It came from behind me. I spun around, but the dog wasn't there anymore. The air felt heavier, suffocating, like the diner itself had become a prison. I wanted to scream, but the sound got caught in my throat, strangled by the sheer terror that had gripped me. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure wasn't just smiling anymore. His eyes were glowing, a deep, unnatural red that sent a shiver down my spine. His body seemed to flicker in and out of the reflection, as though he was no longer bound by the rules of the physical world. I reached out, trembling, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of the mirror. As I did, the dog's reflection mirrored my movement. But it wasn't just mirroring. It was reaching out too. Suddenly, the mirror rippled like water, and I felt the air shift around me. A cold gust of wind blew through the diner, and everything went dark for a moment. When the lights flickered back on, I found myself standing in front of the counter again, but everything was different. The diner looked wrong, older, abandoned, as though it had been untouched for decades. And there, sitting in the booth, was the dog. But he wasn't a dog anymore. The figure in the booth looked like the dog, yes, but now it had the shape of a man. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed a deep, unearthly red. "You're the next one," it said, the words echoing in my mind. It sounded like my own voice, yet somehow not. The voice twisted and stretched, filling every corner of my mind. I tried to run, but my feet felt frozen, as though they were cemented to the floor. I could only watch as the figure in the booth began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate. "There is no escape," it whispered, its voice now all around me, drowning me in its presence. The diner felt even colder now, the shadows around me growing darker, pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering lights above casting eerie shadows that twisted and warped as though they had a life of their own. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, each one heavier than the last. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but the door to the diner was gone. The walls had shifted, trapping me inside. The growl came again, louder this time, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. The dog, it, was right behind me, its presence a weight on my back. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. "You're part of this now," it whispered, its voice coming from all around me, suffocating me, filling me with a cold dread I couldn't escape. And then, the world went black. The attic had always been a place of forgotten things. The old furniture, dusty boxes, and piles of memorabilia from a life that felt far removed from my own. But there was one thing that always caught my eye whenever I ventured up there: the toy chest. It was an antique, carved with intricate designs of playful animals and curious children. The chest had been in the family for generations, and for as long as I could remember it had sat in the corner of the attic, untouched, gathering dust. My parents had told me countless times not to go near it, to stay away from the old toys. But curiosity had always gotten the better of me. And that day, I couldn't resist. I was 12 years old, the age when the boundaries of childhood and adolescence begin to blur, when curiosity outweighs caution. The house was quiet, everyone busy with their own tasks, and the attic, always so mysterious, called to me like a whisper. I climbed up the creaky stairs and into the dim light of the attic. The scent of old wood and mothballs hit me immediately, and the air felt thick with dust. There it was, the toy chest, just as I remembered it. The brass lock that had always been there, untouched, glinted faintly in the low light. I knelt down in front of it, my hands itching to open it. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran my fingers along the cool metal. For some reason, I felt drawn to it, as if something inside the chest was calling me, urging me to open it. It was ridiculous, of course. What could possibly be inside that could still matter after all these years? But as I lifted the lid, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of unease. The chest creaked open, revealing the contents: old toys, worn and faded with age, dolls with cracked porcelain faces, stuffed animals with missing eyes, and wooden blocks stacked haphazardly. Nothing particularly alarming, but something about the way the toys were arranged made my skin crawl. They looked too perfectly placed, as if they were waiting for me to find them. I reached for one of the dolls, its porcelain skin chipped in places, and as I held it in my hands, something strange happened. A faint whisper floated up from the chest. It was soft at first, like a breeze, but then it grew clearer, more insistent. "Help!" I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The whisper came again, clearer now. "Help me, please." I dropped the doll, my heart hammering in my chest. The attic was silent again, the whispers gone as quickly as they had come. I stood there, frozen, my eyes scanning the room as if expecting something or someone to appear. But there was nothing. No one. I quickly slammed the lid shut, the sound of it echoing in the stillness of the attic. What had just happened? Was I imagining things? I didn't know, but my instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of that attic and never come back. I turned to go, my mind racing, but just as I reached the stairs, I heard it again. "Help me." This time, the whisper wasn't from the chest. It came from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the attic was empty. The toys sat as they always had, undisturbed, still, and silent. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, a cold chill creeping over me. And for the first time in my life, I felt a deep sense of dread. Something was wrong, very wrong. I rushed down the stairs, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't get the whisper out of my head, but as I descended into the safety of the first floor, I felt an inexplicable sense of relief. The air was warmer here, and the house felt more grounded. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the attic was still calling to me, still whispering from up above. The next few days were a blur. The memory of the whisper in the attic haunted me, creeping into every corner of my thoughts. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The whisper had been too real, too clear. The night after I first heard it, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I kept hearing it, faint, distant, like a wind chime in the distance. "Help me." Over and over again, it was driving me mad. The next morning, I decided to confront it. I couldn't live with the fear, the uncertainty, not knowing what had happened in that attic. I needed answers. So, I went back. The house was still, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards under my feet as I climbed the stairs once again. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. I hesitated at the threshold, but the pull was too strong. I had to know what was happening. I had to face whatever was in that room. The attic was colder than I remembered. The air felt heavier, thicker, like something was pressing in from all sides. As I stepped inside, I saw the toy chest sitting in the same spot, its brass lock gleaming in the dim light. It was almost like it was calling to me, drawing me in with its silent promise. I walked slowly toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the lid, I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "Help me." I froze, my hand still on the chest, but the whisper wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from the corner of the room. I spun around, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there. Then, I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small, wooden chair, tucked away and nearly forgotten. It was old, too old, and its wood was cracked and weathered. But what caught my attention wasn't the chair itself. It was what was in the chair. A dollar, but not just any doll. It was unlike the others in the chest. This one was different. Its porcelain skin was cracked and stained, its eyes wide open, and it was staring at me. The smile on its face was stretched, twisted into something unnatural. and its mouth seemed to move ever so slightly, as though it were whispering to me. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, sharper, and it came from the doll's mouth. It was the same voice I had heard before, the one that had haunted me. But now it wasn't a whisper. It was a cry for help, a cry that seemed to reach into the very core of my being, begging me to listen, to understand. I took a step toward it, my hand shaking as I reached for the doll. The moment my fingers touched it, the air around me seemed to shift. The room darkened, the temperature plummeted, and the whisper grew louder, more frantic. "Help me, please." I felt the weight of the doll in my hands, its porcelain cold against my skin, and then I saw it. The back of the doll was not smooth like the others. There was a small latch hidden beneath the fabric of its dress, almost as if it had been purposely concealed. Without thinking, I pulled at the latch, and the back of the doll popped open. Inside, there was something that I wasn't expecting. A small folded piece of paper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling, and what I saw made my blood run cold. "It's too late. They know you're here." The words were scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as though the writer had been in a hurry, but it was the last sentence that made my stomach twist. "The toy chest isn't just a toy chest." Before I could process what that meant, the whisper returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from the toy chest itself. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice said, and I realized it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a growl. I backed away slowly, but the chest, it moved. The lid creaked open slightly, and I could see the faintest flicker of movement inside. Something was in there. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the growl echoing through the attic, sending a chill down my spine. My body froze, but my mind screamed for me to run. Every instinct told me to turn and flee, to get out of this house and never look back. But something held me there. The whispering, the growl, the unnatural feeling of the room. It was all too much to ignore. The toy chest creaked again, louder this time, as though something inside was straining against the lid, desperate to get out. I took a step back, my feet dragging, my hands trembling. The lid of the chest began to lift slowly, inch by inch, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, suffocating me with each passing second. And then I saw it. A hand, no, not a hand, but something, emerged from the chest, its fingers long and skeletal, covered in a thin layer of dust. The fingers stretched out, grasping at the air, as though it were reaching for me. I stumbled backward, my body shaking uncontrollably. The whisper became louder, now mixed with a low, guttural laugh that sent waves of terror through me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The hand moved further out of the chest, followed by another, and then a twisted, gaunt face appeared, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. It was a face I didn't recognize, but it was familiar. The skin was mottled in gray, the features stretched and contorted, as though it had once been human, but was now something else. Something that didn't belong in the world I knew. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice growled again, now coming from the figure as it crawled slowly from the chest, its body shifting unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You shouldn't have come back." I turned and bolted for the door, my legs finally responding. But before I could take a step, the room seemed to close in on me. The walls stretched, the shadows warped, and the air became thick with a dark, suffocating presence. I could hear the footsteps of the figure behind me, moving faster, gaining on me, its eerie voice calling out in the darkness. "You're not leaving." I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was trapping me inside. My heart raced in my chest, the panic rising, and I could feel the figure's presence getting closer, its twisted limbs scraping across the floor as it moved. "Help me," I whispered, my voice cracking as I realized there was no escape. The house had changed, had become something else, something that was no longer just a place. It was alive, and I was its prisoner. The figure reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against my arm, and I gasped in horror as its cold touch sent a shock through my body, freezing me in place. I turned slowly, unable to move, and saw the creature's face inches from mine. And then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it whispered one final sentence, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Welcome home." It had been years since I last thought about my childhood home. After everything that happened, I had left town, never looking back, and I convinced myself that I was finally free of the memories. Life moved on, and I built a life for myself in the city. But deep down, I knew that there was one thing I could never escape: my past. That's why I was surprised, and more than a little unsettled, when I received a letter in the mail one chilly afternoon. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged as though it had been hurriedly written. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the envelope. I felt a strange sense of dread wash over me as I opened it. The letter was simple, short, and to the point. "I remember what happened that summer. You can't hide from the past. It will find you, no matter how far you run." I stared at the letter in disbelief. My hands were shaking. How could anyone know about that summer? About the things I had tried so hard to forget? The memories came rushing back all at once. Too fast, too sharp. The long hot days, the strange disappearances, the eerie feeling that something was always watching. The summer I turned 12, when everything changed. Who could possibly know? I had kept those secrets buried deep within me, far away from anyone who could uncover them. The letter was signed with a name I didn't recognize: Eli Turner. I put the letter down on the table, my heart racing. The name seemed vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Had I known someone by that name when I was younger? I was sure of it. I hadn't. But the message, it was unmistakable. Someone from my past had found me. They knew something about that summer, about the things I had seen and done, and they weren't going to let me forget it. I couldn't stop the unease from creeping up my spine. Who was this person? And why were they reaching out now, after all these years? I decided I had to go back. I needed answers. I couldn't let this shadow from my past follow me any longer. I had to return to the small town I'd left behind, to the house that had haunted my memories. I had to face whatever it was that this stranger knew. The drive back felt like a lifetime. The familiar roads, the trees lining the way, the small town I had once called home. It all seemed so much smaller now. The town hadn't changed much, but I felt different, like a part of me was still stuck in the past, caught in the memories I had tried to outrun. When I pulled up in front of the house, it looked the same. The old Victorian house, with its peeling paint and overgrown yard, still stood tall and imposing, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't help but feel a wave of nostalgia mixed with dread. It felt like stepping back into a dream I hadn't wanted to relive. I took a deep breath and walked up to the front door, hesitating before I reached for the handle. But before I could open it, I heard something. A soft sound, almost like a whisper coming from inside. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. The whisper was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. Someone was inside. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was dark, the air thick with dust and memories. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and that's when I saw him. The man standing in the hallway, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. It was Eli Turner. Eli Turner stood in the hallway, his presence filling the room with an unsettling heaviness. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. There he was, standing as if he had been waiting for me all these years, his expression unreadable. "How did you find me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. "Who are you?" Eli didn't answer right away. He just watched me with those piercing eyes, his face a mask of calm. His appearance seemed strangely familiar, yet foreign, as if I had seen him before but couldn't quite place when or where. "I know everything," he said softly, his voice low and filled with something dark, something I couldn't quite understand. His words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How did he know? How could he possibly know about that summer? The one I had buried so deep inside me, the one I thought was long forgotten. The house felt colder now, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I could hear the distant creak of the floorboards above us, as if something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why come back after all these years?" Eli took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "Because it's time for you to remember," he said, his words sending a cold shiver through me. "It's time for you to face what you've been running from." I took a step back, my hands trembling. "What are you talking about? I don't remember anything." He smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was an empty smile, devoid of warmth. "You remember more than you think," he said. "You remember everything, but you've locked it away. Now, it's coming for you. You can't hide from the past anymore." I felt the walls of the house closing in around me, suffocating me, as if the very house itself was alive, watching me, waiting. My heart raced, my chest tight, and I could hear the whisper again, louder this time. It was a voice I recognized, but it wasn't just the voice of Eli, it was the voice of something much older, much darker. And then the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, I saw something move in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, and I felt the presence of something, or someone, looming just beyond my reach. Eli's voice broke through the growing panic. "It's time. The house is calling you. You can't run anymore." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside the house with Eli and the voices that now filled the air. The floorboards creaked, and I could feel the house breathing, its pulse in the very walls around me. I turned to Eli, my chest heaving with panic. "What is this? What is happening?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes darkening as he gestured toward the stairs. "It's waiting for you upstairs. Go." I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face whatever waited upstairs, but I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. I had to face the truth. I had to confront whatever nightmare I had left behind. I took a deep breath and began to ascend the stairs, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding in my ears. The house felt like it was shifting around me, the walls pressing in, the air thick with something I couldn't name. As I reached the top of the stairs, the door to the attic opened by itself, the hinges creaking as if beckoning me forward. The whispering grew louder, filling my head, overwhelming me. I stepped into the attic, and there it was, the thing I had feared all these years. The old toy chest sitting in the center of the room, just as I remembered it. But this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with dolls, their faces cracked, their eyes staring blankly at me. I could feel their gaze, each one a silent accusation. And then, in the center of the chest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, crumpled note. I reached for it, my hands shaking, and unfolded the paper. My eyes widened in shock as I read the words, "You remember now. We're all still here. We've been waiting." Before I could react, the toys in the chest began to move. Their heads turned toward me, their eyes following my every move as if they were alive. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I had never truly escaped my past. The house, the toys, the whispers, they were all part of it. All part of the thing I had locked away in my mind. And now, it was coming back for me. The first time I heard the footsteps, I thought it was just the house settling. You know how it is with old homes. Creaking floors, doors that groan when the wind hits them just right. I've lived in the house for over a year now, and I had gotten used to the little noises that would echo through the halls when the world outside was quiet. But that night, the footsteps were different. It was late, and I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard them. Slow, deliberate, the soft patter of footsteps on the second floor. I paused, listening. The sound of footsteps, no mistaking it, walking across the hallway above me. They were faint but distinct, like someone was walking through the house, just out of sight. My heart raced. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just the house's usual creaks. But this time it felt different. More intentional, more human. I stood up and walked to the foot of the stairs, staring into the darkness of the upper floor. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel it. The presence just out of view. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but I couldn't explain why. I took a deep breath and decided to check it out. As I made my way up the stairs, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The old house seemed too quiet, as though it was holding its breath. The air was thick with tension. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the worn carpet. I peered into the rooms, one by one, expecting to find an explanation. A window left open, a draft, a shift in the house's structure. But everything was just as I had left it. Except for one thing. In the room at the end of the hall, the door was slightly ajar. I could see the faintest sliver of light coming from inside, though I hadn't turned on any lamps. It was as if the room was waiting for me. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The footsteps had stopped, but the unease remained. I had grown up in this house, spent years in these very rooms, but tonight the place felt alien to me, as though something had changed. I pushed the door open, and a wave of cold air washed over me. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one detail, something on the floor near the corner. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I made out what it was. A small, worn shoe, a child's shoe. I bent down to pick it up, the coldness of it sending a shiver down my spine. I hadn't seen this shoe before. It wasn't mine. It wasn't something I'd bought. I turned it over in my hand, examining it closely, and that's when I saw it, the name, faintly written on the sole in black ink. Emma. My stomach twisted. I had never known anyone named Emma. The name didn't ring a bell, and yet something about it felt familiar, too familiar. I glanced around the room again, my pulse quickening. The air in the room was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. It felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. The same slow, deliberate pace, but this time they were coming from inside the room. I whipped around. but there was nothing. The room was empty. No one was there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the corner, my mind racing. I couldn't understand it. Who was here? What was in this room with me? The footsteps continued, closer now, as if whoever or whatever was walking toward me. Then the whisper came. Soft, almost a breath, but unmistakable. "You found me." I froze. The whisper echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls like it was coming from all directions. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it carried a familiarity, a weight that made my skin crawl. It was soft, yet clear, like someone was standing right behind me, whispering into my ear. I spun around, but the room was still empty. Nothing had moved. No one had appeared. The air felt thick with tension, and the footsteps, once slow and deliberate, had now stopped completely. It was as if the house had exhaled, holding its breath for what was to come. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of the situation. The child's shoe still clutched tightly in my hand, and the name Emma written on the sole burned in my thoughts like an unanswered question. Who was Emma? The name gnawed at me, but I couldn't remember ever hearing it before. I tried to push the thought away, to rationalize it, but the strange feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The room, the house, everything felt wrong. I turned and walked toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt something tug at my sleeve. I gasped and jerked my arm away, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing was there. I shook my head, trying to shake off the panic rising in my chest. This is just your mind playing tricks, I told myself. It's an old house. There are drafts. Maybe it's the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something else in this house. Something that had been here long before me. Long before I ever moved back. Something that had been waiting. The door creaked open slowly behind me, and I turned, expecting to see a draft from the hallway. But instead, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, a woman. She was tall, dressed in a faded blue dress, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was as though time had frozen in place, and I was trapped in the silence of that moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, like a lullaby, but laced with something darker. "You found me," she whispered again, her eyes locking onto mine. "But now you must help me." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. The woman took a step forward, her movement slow, deliberate. Her eyes never left mine. "You're the one," she said, her voice barely audible. "The one who can set me free." I shook my head, the words making no sense. "Set you free?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The woman's face remained expressionless. Her lips parted just enough to speak again. "Emma?" she whispered, her voice shaking as she said the name. "Emma is the one who can help me. You know her." I recoiled, my mind racing. The name Emma again. But I didn't understand. I had never met anyone named Emma. I had no connection to the name. The woman took another step forward, her hand reaching out toward me, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming, cold rush over me. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the air. Then the woman's face contorted. Her features twisted in a way that seemed unnatural, as if her very being was changing in front of my eyes. Her skin began to crack, and her eyes, those dark, wide eyes, began to bulge, as though they were being stretched from within. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but the woman kept coming closer. The footsteps from earlier started again, slow and deliberate, as though someone else was in the house, moving in sync with her every step. "Help me," the woman rasped, her voice now a distorted whisper. "You must help me before it's too late, before she comes." I couldn't comprehend what she was saying, but the terror in her voice was undeniable. Whatever had happened here, whatever had been hidden in this house, it was still alive, waiting. I turned to run, but as I did, the door slammed shut in front of me, trapping me in the room with her. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The woman's distorted figure stepped closer, her smile now impossibly wide. "She's already here," she whispered. "Emma is coming for you." I felt the weight of her words settle on me like a suffocating blanket. "Emma is coming for you." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down as the temperature continued to drop. The cold was unbearable now, making my breath visible in front of me, each exhale a mist of fear. The woman's twisted figure loomed in front of me, her once human features now contorted into something monstrous, something that didn't belong in this world. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening, but there were no answers. Just the unrelenting fear, the whispers in the air, and the sound of footsteps approaching echoing through the room. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Who is Emma?" "What do you want from me?" The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that seemed to stretch far too wide, unnatural in its grotesque distortion. "You already know," she hissed, her voice low and full of malice. "You've always known." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. My hands shook as I grasped the door handle again, desperate, but it was still locked. Impossible to open. I was trapped. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The whispering increased, swirling around me like a hurricane, crashing against my eardrums. And then a voice, one I hadn't heard in years, echoed through the room, as clear as if the person was standing right behind me. "Help me, Emma." My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. It was my own voice. I spun around, my pulse racing, my mind spinning. The figure in the corner of the room was me, or at least it looked like me. A reflection of myself, standing with eyes wide, hollow, empty. It wasn't just my image, it was her. The person I had tried to forget. The twin I never knew I had. "Emma?" I whispered, horrified. "But how? What is this?" The reflection of me, no, she, stretched her arm toward me. A slow, deliberate movement that seemed to come from somewhere deep, somewhere ancient. "I've always been here," she said, her voice echoing my own, but twisted, like a version of me that had been lost to time. "I've always been a part of you. You've just forgotten." Tears blurred my vision as I looked at her, at myself, and for the first time I realized the truth. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't some figment of my imagination. The reflection wasn't just a reflection. She was real, and she was coming for me. The footsteps grew louder, the whispers overwhelming, and I could feel something pulling me toward the reflection, drawing me in like a magnet. My legs were unresponsive, my body unwilling to move, as though it was no longer mine to control. I reached out instinctively, my fingers trembling, and as I touched the mirror, the glass rippled, distorting around my hand, like water. Before I could withdraw, the reflection of me, Emma, reached out, grabbing my wrist with an unnatural strength. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the deafening roar of the whispers, and then everything went dark. It was a strange thing to find. An old, tattered envelope in the corner of my living room, wedged between the couch and the wall. At first, I thought it was just junk mail that had somehow fallen behind the furniture. But there was something about it that caught my attention. It wasn't like any envelope I had ever seen. The paper was thick and aged, the edges frayed as if it had been sitting there for years. I picked it up, examining the faded handwriting on the front. My name was scrawled across the front in messy, hurried strokes. But there was no return address, no stamp, nothing except for a small, smudged mark on the back of the envelope. A dark, almost imperceptible blotch that seemed like it had been pressed there on purpose. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as I tore open the envelope, my fingers trembling with anticipation. Inside, there was only a single piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I unfolded it carefully, and the words on the page hit me like a punch to the gut. "I know what you did." I stared at the words, my mind racing. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I had no idea who could have sent this, or how they knew about that night, the night I never spoke of, the night I had tried to bury deep inside me, hoping it would stay forgotten. But now it was back, and it was coming for me. I thought back to that night, the way the air had felt thick with tension, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, the strange feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I had been alone in my apartment, or so I thought, but when I looked back, the strange occurrences, the things I couldn't explain, all began to make sense. I had never told anyone about what happened. No one could know. But now, someone else knew. They knew what I had done. I looked down at the letter again, my eyes scanning the rest of the message. It was always you, wasn't it? I froze. How could they know? How could they possibly know what I had done, what I had seen? The letter didn't end there. Below the message, there was something else written. Something that made my stomach churn. You can't hide from it. The shadow is waiting. The words were scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The ink smeared at the edges like the writer had been too anxious to keep their thoughts contained. I set the letter down, my mind racing. The shadow? What did that mean? Was someone playing a cruel joke on me? I ran my fingers through my hair, pacing back and forth across the room. This couldn't be happening. I had moved away, started fresh. I had done everything I could to put that night behind me. But this letter, this message, it felt real. It felt like someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to remind me of the past. I turned toward the window, glancing out into the night. The street was dark, the lights of the city far off in the distance. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, as I looked closer, something in the shadows shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I squinted, trying to make it out, but the figure was too far away, too blurry. I shook my head, dismissing it as my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. This time, the figure was closer, just at the edge of the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it. The shape was familiar. It was me. I stared at the figure outside, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure standing in the shadows was unmistakable. It was me. The same posture, the same height, even the same clothes I had worn earlier that day. But there was something wrong about it, something that didn't belong. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cold window, trying to see more clearly. My eyes strained in the dark, but every time I thought I saw it, the figure would move slightly. slipping back into the darkness like a shadow retreating from the light. My heart began to pound in my chest as the realization hit me. This wasn't a trick of the light. There was something standing outside, something or someone that looked exactly like me, mimicking my every move. I turned away from the window, backing up, my pulse racing. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on me as the shadows seemed to stretch further, curling around the corners like dark fingers reaching for me. The whisper from the letter echoed in my mind. The shadow is waiting. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I dialed the number for the police. But just as I was about to press the call button, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. The sound came from the door. Soft at first, but then louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, staring at the door, as though the very act of looking at it might stop whatever was about to happen. My mouth went dry, and I felt my feet locked to the floor, my body paralyzed with fear. Who could it be? Who was out there? The knock came again, harder this time, and I stumbled back, my breath quickening. My mind raced, wondering if the figure outside was somehow connected to whatever this was. But as I slowly approached the door, I couldn't help but feel like something was terribly wrong. The air around me seemed too still, too quiet. My own heartbeat was too loud, echoing in the silence. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and before I could stop myself, I opened the door. Standing there in the dim light of the hallway was me, the same face, the same clothes, the same hair. It was me, standing in the doorway, smiling. But it wasn't the smile I knew. It was cold, empty. There was no warmth in it, no recognition, just a hollow, unsettling grin that seemed to stretch too wide, almost unnatural. You? I stammered, trying to comprehend what was happening. Who are you? The figure didn't speak at first, just stood there watching me. And then, in a voice that was too calm, too familiar, it whispered, "You know me." I felt my stomach twist. I knew that voice. It was mine, but it wasn't. It was distorted, like an echo bouncing off the walls of my mind. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure in the doorway stepped forward, slowly, methodically, never taking its eyes off me. "It's too late," it said, its voice low and taunting. "You should have never opened that letter." The air grew colder, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, trapping me in the room. The figure, still standing in the hallway, remained perfectly still, its eyes never leaving mine. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the whispers again, swirling in my ears like a storm. "Help me. You know me. It's too late." And then, the most terrifying thing happened. The figure moved. But not like a person. It was too fast, too fluid, as if it was gliding through the air, too perfect in its movements. It was no longer just a copy of me, it was something else. It was becoming me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with fear, and then as I turned to run, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably mine, came from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was the person in the hallway truly me? Was it some sort of twisted reflection? Some part of me that had broken free? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had been waiting, hidden for all these years. The door behind me rattled, and I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I heard a voice from the other side, faint at first, but growing louder. "You can't run from what's inside you." The voice behind the door grew louder, sharper, as if the very air in the room was thickening with its words. You can't run from what's inside you. It felt like a taunt, a warning, and a promise all wrapped in one. I stood there, paralyzed, the weight of the words sinking deep into my chest. The cold, empty eyes of the figure in the hallway burned into me, and I felt as though I were being torn apart from the inside. I backed into the corner of the room, my body trembling, my chest tight with fear. The door rattled again, more violently this time, and the whispers around me began to grow, louder and more frantic. The footsteps in the hallway echoed, but now they were joined by others, my footsteps, filling the room, closing in from all sides. I could hear them, feel them, even though no one was moving. I looked toward the figure again. It had moved closer, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore, it was taking me, piece by piece. I could see it now, the way its features distorted, warping into mine, my hair, my eyes, my face, but its smile, it wasn't mine. It was something twisted, something malevolent. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking, "I'm not you." The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "You've always been me," it said softly, its voice now a perfect mirror of my own, but filled with something darker. "You just didn't know it yet." My mind reeled, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. It was me. It was a part of me, something I had locked away long ago, a secret I had buried in the deepest corners of my mind. But now it had escaped, and it was coming for me. It had been waiting. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly the walls felt like they were closing in. My breaths were shallow, my hands shaking as I reached out, trying to steady myself, but the shadows were creeping around me, pulling me into their embrace. The footsteps came from every direction, an endless parade of footsteps, my footsteps, all leading to one place, the figure standing in front of me, growing closer, becoming me. I backed into the wall, my mind breaking apart, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. "I didn't do it," I choked out. "I didn't choose this." The figure's grin widened, its eyes hollow. "You did. You've always been me. You just never wanted to see it." I could feel it now, the pull, the suffocating weight of it, the darkness that had always been inside me, hidden in the deepest parts of my soul. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that there was no escape. It was me, all of it. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure. It had always been me, and I could never outrun it. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the reflection in the window, the reflection of us. And I knew, with horrifying clarity, that I had become the thing I feared the most. 1. It was late when the call came in. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, barely paying attention to anything in particular. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Monday night. I had just finished my dinner and was preparing to go to bed when my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but that wasn't unusual. Still, something in my gut told me to answer. I swiped to accept the call, and a familiar voice immediately greeted me. "Rachel, is that you?" I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't one I recognized, yet it sounded so familiar, so comforting, like someone I should know. My mind raced, trying to place it. Who was this? Why did they sound so sure of who I was? "I'm sorry. Who is this?" I replied cautiously, my voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to hesitate for a moment. "It's John, from the trip. We were supposed to meet last year, do you remember?" John. The name struck a chord, but it was a faint echo, something buried deep in my memory. A trip. What trip? I racked my brain, trying to recall, but the harder I tried, the more elusive it became. I had been on so many trips, met so many people. Who was this John? I'm not sure I remember. Can you remind me? I asked, my voice trembling just a little. There was something unsettling about this conversation, something that didn't sit right with me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. It was as if John was considering something, deciding whether or not to continue. Then, finally, he spoke again, his tone softer but still insistent. I knew it was you, Rachel. I knew you'd be confused. But you've been avoiding me, haven't you? I recoiled slightly, taken aback by the words. I'm sorry, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't know anyone named John. But the man on the other end of the phone didn't seem convinced. No, Rachel, you remember. You have to. You can't pretend like it didn't happen. The way he said it, so sure, so calm, was like a jolt of electricity running through me. Something about this felt so real, so true. I couldn't explain why, but deep down, I knew I had to remember. I had to. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My head was spinning. The memories I had buried so deeply were starting to surface, but they were hazy, fragmented. I told you to stay away, Rachel. John's voice continued, now laced with a strange mixture of sadness and anger. But you couldn't leave it alone, could you? My heart raced. What was he talking about? What had happened? The fear and anxiety building inside me were overwhelming. I had to get to the bottom of this. I needed answers. I'm sorry, I said, my voice shaky. I don't know what you're talking about. I really think you've got the wrong person. There was another pause, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Rachel, you've been ignoring the truth. You think I won't find you, but I always know where you are. Suddenly, I could feel the air in the room grow thick, like I wasn't alone anymore. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around the room, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The room seemed too still, too quiet. My breath came faster, each exhale echoing in the silence. What do you want from me? I demanded, trying to hide the fear in my voice. The response came quickly, chillingly clear. I want you to remember, Rachel, you made a mistake. You've always known, and now you're going to fix it. I felt my stomach drop. The man on the other end wasn't just some stranger, was he, number? He knew me, and somehow he knew more about me than I was comfortable with. I turned back to my phone, my fingers shaking as I glanced at the screen. The call had ended. The phone was still in my hand, but my heart wasn't in my chest anymore. It had dropped into the pit of my stomach where it sat heavy, pounding. What just happened? Who was that? And what had he meant by, "You're going to fix it"? I stood up, my legs shaky. I needed to get out of here, to clear my head. But as I reached for the door, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I stood there, frozen in place, my hand still gripping the door handle. The sensation of being watched, that cold, creeping feeling, intensified with each passing second. It was as though the room itself had shifted, like the walls were closing in, pressing in on me from all sides. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The call, that voice, it had all thrown me off balance, and now my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to take a deep breath and stepped away from the door. The apartment was still, too still. The quiet was suffocating. I tried to distract myself, grabbing my phone again to check if there were any new messages, anything to ground me in reality. But as soon as I unlocked the screen, a new notification popped up. You're not alone, Rachel." My breath hitched, and the phone nearly slipped from my hands. The message had come from an unknown number, again. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to face it. But somehow I couldn't stop myself. My fingers hovered over the screen before I tapped it open. It was another text. Only this one wasn't like the previous one. It was brief, to the point. "You were there. You know what you did." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, demanding my attention. My mind raced, but nothing seemed to make sense. I didn't know what I had done. I couldn't remember. But somehow I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me like an unspoken truth I was trying to ignore. I quickly typed a response, my hands trembling. "What do you want from me?" I wrote. "Who are you?" The seconds dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed answers. I needed to know who this person was, why they knew my name, and why they were making me relive whatever it was I had tried so hard to forget. And then the reply came. "I'm closer than you think, Rachel. I've always been close." A wave of nausea washed over me. My skin felt cold, like ice was coursing through my veins. The room seemed to shrink around me, and I felt the urge to run, to escape, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was as though the phone was pulling me into something, like a trap I couldn't avoid. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling that the room was growing darker, as if the shadows were creeping in. Something felt wrong. And then it hit me. The phone wasn't the only thing in my hands anymore. I turned slowly, my eyes locking onto something at the far corner of the room. There, sitting on the small coffee table, was a photo frame. A photo frame I didn't remember placing there. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't even noticed it before. I moved toward it, my feet dragging, my every step heavy with dread. As I picked it up, the unease in my chest grew, a sense of dread pooling at the bottom of my stomach. The photo inside the frame was old, faded, and there, in the center, were faces I knew all too well. My childhood friends, all of us smiling, standing together in front of a cabin deep in the woods. But there was something wrong with this photo. There was something new in it. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible at first, was the figure of a man. A man I didn't recognize, but whose face seemed disturbingly familiar. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and they seemed to be staring directly at me from the picture. I felt the air grow heavier. My throat tightened, and my breath came in short gasps. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. How had it gotten there? It was like it hadn't been there before. I stumbled back, the photo slipping from my hands and crashing to the floor, shattering the glass. My eyes darted around the room, and then I heard it. The faintest sound, a rustling behind me coming from the hallway. I turned, but the hallway was empty. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call, not a message. I didn't want to pick it up, but I had no choice. The number flashed on the screen, and it was the same number as before, the one that had haunted me all night. With shaking hands, I accepted the call. "Rachel," the voice said. Its tone still calm, but now tinged with something darker, more insistent. "You remember now, don't you?" I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat, as if my body was refusing to acknowledge what my mind had finally accepted. This wasn't just a random call. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was someone from my past, someone who knew things I couldn't remember but needed to remember. "You know exactly who I am," the voice continued. "And you know exactly why I'm here, to finish what you started." The phone went dead. I stared at the screen, still gripping it tightly in my hand. I couldn't breathe. The room had become suffocating, like it was closing in around me. I had to get out. I had to find out what was happening. But as I stood up, ready to leave, I heard something. A soft whisper, barely audible. It was coming from behind me. "Don't go." I froze, the words vibrating through my body. "Don't go." I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper had been so soft, so faint, yet unmistakable. It was as if it had come from right behind me, but the hallway was empty. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer, deeper. I could almost feel the air thickening, as if something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. I tried to steady my breath, to calm the panic rising in my chest, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. And then I saw it. On the floor, next to the shattered photo frame, lay something I hadn't noticed before. A small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the same weight as the letter I'd once found years ago, a letter I had forgotten about until this very moment. The edges were torn, the ink smudged, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The words on the paper were brief, but they sent an icy chill down my spine. "It's not over. We're not done, Rachel. You know what you did, and it's time to face it." I dropped the paper, my heart racing. The words felt like a punch to the gut, pushing all my memories to the surface. The trip to the woods, the night I had tried to forget, the things we had done there, the promises I had made, the lies I had buried. And the man in the photo. The room felt like it was spinning. I stumbled back, and the phone buzzed again. I couldn't pick it up. I couldn't face the voice anymore. But the buzz came again, and this time I couldn't resist. I grabbed the phone, but this time, when I answered, there was no voice. Just static. A faint crackling sound, like a radio that couldn't find its station. Then, through the static, a single word came through, clear and sharp. "Remember," I gasped, dropping the phone. My mind was a whirlwind, the fragments of memory crashing into each other, a jumbled mess of faces, places, and events I had spent years trying to forget. But then, a new thought pierced through. What if this wasn't just a haunting? What if it was something I had set into motion all those years ago? What if this was the price of the promises I had made, the things I had buried in the past? The phone rang again, but this time I didn't answer. I stood there, frozen, staring at the walls of my apartment. The silence felt thick and suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. Then the doorbell rang. A slow, deliberate chime that echoed through the stillness. The hairs on my neck stood up. The voice, the man, the whispers, it was all coming together. I had to face it. I had no choice. I turned toward the door, my legs shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but my feet were already moving. I reached the door and slowly, reluctantly, I turned the knob. The door swung open, and there, standing in front of me, was no one. But on the floor, just inside the door, lay a single object, a photograph face down. My heart sank as I bent to pick it up. When I turned it over, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, standing alone in the woods, and in the background, just behind me, stood the man from the photo. He was smiling. I was traveling for work, staying in a hotel that looked more like an old mansion than a modern building. It had that musty, vintage smell, with the kind of charm that made you feel like you were stepping into a time long gone. The lobby was grand, with its marble floors and chandeliers, but it still felt strangely cold, as though the building had forgotten what warmth felt like. I checked in late at night, after a long flight, tired and eager to get to my room. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with dark circles under his eyes, handed me the key without much of a smile, his hands shaking slightly as he slid it across the counter. "Room 312, he muttered. "It's on the 3rd floor. It's a quiet floor." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It wasn't unusual for hotels to emphasize quiet floors, and besides, I was too tired to ask any questions. I made my way to the elevator, the dim lighting casting strange shadows along the hall. The elevator creaked as it ascended, the faint hum of machinery filling the otherwise silent air. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, I stepped out into an empty corridor, lined with old paintings and faded carpets. I walked down the hall, searching for room 312, but something felt off. The air was thick, stagnant, and the hallway seemed longer than it should have been. The walls felt like they were closing in as I passed room after room, 301, 302, 303, but no 312. I stopped, confused. Maybe I had missed it? I retraced my steps, but the hallway had no room numbered 312. Instead, the next door read 315. I frowned. I was certain the receptionist had told me it was room 312. I walked back to the elevator, intending to ask the receptionist if there was some mistake, but when I reached the lobby, he was gone. The desk was unmanned, the light above flickering like a warning. I looked around, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I couldn't understand why the receptionist had been so hurried, why no one else was around. The entire building seemed too still, like it was holding its breath. I stood there for a few minutes, considering my options, when a voice behind me made me jump. "You're looking for room 312, aren't you?" I spun around to face a woman standing near the far corner of the lobby. She was older, with short, graying hair and a stern face, dressed in an old-fashioned hotel uniform. She was watching me with a piercing gaze, her expression unreadable. Yes, I am," I stammered. "I was just trying to find my room, but—" "You won't find it," she said, her voice cold and knowing. "That room doesn't exist." I stared at her, unable to process her words. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. "It's just an old part of the hotel," she continued. "It's been sealed off for years. The room was never meant to be on the floor plan." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? I was just told I'd be staying in room 312. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she gave a small, knowing smile and walked away, disappearing down a side corridor. I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, my mind racing. What did she mean by sealed off? Why had the receptionist given me a key to a room that didn't exist? It didn't make any sense. I returned to the 3rd floor, determined to find the room. This time, I walked slowly, carefully, checking the door numbers as I passed. I reached 315 again, and then 310. I kept moving, feeling more and more unsettled. And then I saw it. At the very end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, marked only with a faded number. 312. My heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be right. I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. When I pushed it open, the room was dark, cold, and empty. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The room was exactly as you would expect a room left abandoned for so long to look, old, forgotten, and almost haunted. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing off the walls, and then I saw something strange. A journal, lying on the desk in the corner, its cover worn with age. It was odd to see something so out of place in such a forgotten room, so I picked it up, brushing off the dust. The first page was filled with scribbled notes, mostly incoherent. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, but as I flipped through the pages, one sentence caught my eye. "The door will not open unless you know the truth." I shivered. I didn't know what that meant, but it felt like a warning. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, the faintest creak. I spun around, but the door to the room had slammed shut. I rushed toward it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. And then the whispering began. It started faint, like someone talking just out of earshot. The words were indecipherable at first, but slowly they began to grow clearer until I could make them out. "You were never meant to stay here." The temperature in the room dropped, and the walls seemed to close in on me. My pulse quickened as I looked around, searching for a way out, but there was no escape. The room was a trap. "You should have never come here," the voice whispered again, closer now, like it was right beside me. I pressed my ear to the door, but the voice had already stopped. The hall outside was silent. With trembling hands, I pulled the journal from my pocket and looked at the last page. The words were clearer than ever. "The room never existed, but you will." I looked around again, feeling a suffocating sense of dread. What did that mean? The room never existed, but I would? As I stood there, trapped in room 312, the floor beneath me began to shake, the walls seemed to pulse, and the whispering started again. This time, I could hear the words clearly. "You can never leave." The air in the room felt thick, as though the walls themselves were breathing, closing in on me with every passing second. I was trapped, the door firmly locked, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, my breath shallow, trying to hear any sounds from the hallway. But there was nothing. Silence. An eerie, heavy silence. My hands shook as I turned back to the room, my eyes darting over the old furniture, the thick layer of dust covering everything, as though the room had been abandoned for years. No, decades. There was something wrong about this place. Something far deeper than I could comprehend. The journal in my hands was now more of a weight than a clue. The more I read, the more confused I became. The entries were fragmented, some written in a hurried, jagged script, while others were almost perfectly neat, as if someone had been carefully documenting their thoughts for years. Some entries made no sense at all, while others seemed to tell a story I wasn't prepared to understand. I flipped to the last entry, my fingers trembling as I scanned the text. "I've been here for years. I shouldn't have come. I shouldn't have stayed. Room 312 is not on the floor plan. It's not even real. But once you enter, there's no leaving. Time doesn't pass here. It's stuck. Stuck in the moment you first walk through the door. And now I'm a part of it. So will you be." The words chilled me to the bone. I looked around the room again, my mind spinning. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that peeled in some spots, and there was a large mirror on the far wall, its glass cracked like something had hit it long ago. But the most unsettling part, it was facing me. I walked toward the mirror, my reflection distorted by the cracks in the glass. But there was something strange. My reflection wasn't moving the same way I was. My body stood still, but in the mirror I saw my reflection shift, as if it was doing something different, something I wasn't doing. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I looked away from the mirror, but then, in the reflection, I saw something else. Something that wasn't me. In the dark corner of the room, just behind me, a shadow moved. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. What the hell is going on? I stared at the mirror once more, but this time I was sure I saw something new. A figure, barely visible in the farthest corner, standing motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out the details of its face, but I felt its presence. And then, in the reflection, the figure took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, eyes wide, my pulse thundering in my ears, but when I turned around, the room was still. Empty. Nothing was there. The reflection smiled at me. It was an impossibly wide, toothy grin. My heart stopped as I looked into my own eyes in the mirror, but it wasn't my face looking back. It was the face of the figure, the one I had seen in the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered in the mirror. Its voice was my own, but twisted, distorted. "You're already part of it." I turned quickly, but the reflection still grinned at me from the mirror, its eyes locked with mine. It was like I was seeing myself, but not. The reflection was alive, and it wasn't me anymore. It was something else, something that belonged in this place. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the mirror cracked further, the glass splintering, but still, I couldn't look away. My reflection continued to smile, its grin widening, the eyes growing darker, more hollow. Then there was a knock at the door. I jumped, startled, and rushed to the door, nearly throwing myself against it in my desperation. I tried the handle, but it was still locked tight. The knocking continued, urgent, forceful, and then I heard the voice again, not from the phone this time, but from outside the door. "You're not alone, Rachel. You're never alone in room 312. I pressed my ear to the door, my breath ragged. The voice wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside my mind. I could hear it, clear as day, whispering to me, trying to claw its way in. The knocking grew louder, almost frantic. I turned to the window, but it was covered with heavy curtains, blocking out any light from the outside. I could barely make out my own reflection in the glass. It wasn't the reflection I recognized. It was the figure from the corner of the room. "You've already made your choice," it whispered, its voice chilling and sweet. "Now you'll stay forever." I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the air thickening, suffocating me. The door continued to bang, the voice outside growing more frantic, more desperate. But I was frozen, unable to move. I could feel my reflection, the real reflection, closing in on me, getting closer, moving toward me even though I wasn't. And then, the door suddenly swung open. The door swung open with a deafening creak, but there was no one on the other side. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me, bathed in the dim light of the flickering bulbs overhead. The silence that followed was deafening, almost suffocating. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. The knocking had stopped, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. But as I stepped cautiously into the hallway, a cold breeze brushed against my skin, and the lights above me flickered again. Something wasn't right. The hallway was longer than I remembered, and the paintings on the walls seemed to blur, their details shifting and changing when I looked away. The air felt thick, like I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. I glanced back at room 312, its door now fully open, revealing only darkness within. The reflection in the mirror still grinned at me from the room. But there was something else, something new. The door to room 312 closed slowly, almost of its own accord, as if it had never been open in the first place. I turned back toward the hallway, but when I did, the walls seemed to shift again, the patterns of the wallpaper morphing into something unrecognizable. The hallway seemed endless now, stretching forward into infinity. It was no longer the hotel I had entered. It was something else, something alive. I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, pressing tighter with every step I took. I ran, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the sound reverberating in my ears as the hallway twisted and warped around me. The reflection, the grin. It had all been a warning. I had made the wrong choice. But what had I done? What was happening? I glanced over my shoulder one last time, but when I looked back, the hallway behind me was gone. It was replaced by a door, room 312, its number barely visible through the thick fog that had descended over the hotel. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze just before I touched it. A whisper, my whisper, came from the room. "You never leave, Rachel. You never escape." With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was no longer the dusty, forgotten place it had been. It was pristine, new even, as though it had been freshly prepared for me. The mirror on the wall was no longer cracked. The furniture was neatly arranged, the bed made up perfectly, as if I had always belonged here. But I didn't belong here. I tried to turn and leave, but the door had disappeared. The walls pressed in around me, and the reflection in the mirror, my reflection, stared back at me, still smiling, still grinning wider, the darkness in its eyes growing deeper. And then a voice, my voice, whispered in the room, "You're part of it now. You've always been part of it." The wall shuddered. The room began to distort, and the door behind me was gone, replaced by a mirror. I reached out, touching the glass, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, like the breath of the room itself. The reflection smiled at me once again, the wide grin now consuming my face, my body, as if I had become a part of the room itself. And then the room went dark. It started on a normal Tuesday, an ordinary day like any other. I was just sitting at my desk, working through some old files that had been piling up for weeks. The hum of the office, the sound of phones ringing, and the chatter of colleagues in the background was nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just as I was about to finish a report, I received a message that would change everything. The notification popped up on my phone, an unknown number flashing across the screen. I hesitated before opening it. A strange unease crawled up my spine. It was late in the afternoon, and most of the office was winding down for the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I opened the message. "I remember you, Sarah. I remember what happened in the woods. You can't forget either." My blood ran cold. The words felt like they were straight out of a nightmare. I stared at the message for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. What happened in the woods? I didn't remember anything like that. I tried to think back, but my mind was blank, just a wall of empty space where memories should have been. Who was this person? How did they know my name? And more importantly, how did they know about the woods? The message didn't make sense. It was as though it was speaking to some forgotten part of my past, a part that I had buried so deeply that I had completely blocked it out. My fingers hovered over the phone, unsure whether to reply or ignore it. Before I could decide, another message came through. This one was even more unsettling. "You promised you'd never tell anyone. But I'm going to remind you of the truth. Don't you remember what we did that night?" I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. This wasn't some random prank. This person knew something about me, something about my past, and it wasn't something I could brush off. I quickly typed a response, my hand shaking as I did. "Who is this? What are you talking about? I don't remember anything about the woods." The reply came immediately. "I don't expect you to remember, but I'll help you. You will remember soon enough. You can't hide from the truth, Sarah." I dropped my phone onto the desk, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know who this person was or how they knew me, but there was something in their words that felt too real, too close. I felt a creeping fear wash over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being dragged into something I wasn't prepared for. I stood up, pacing around the office, trying to clear my head. I thought about the message, what happened in the woods. I couldn't remember. I didn't even know why it sounded so familiar. It was as if a part of me was fighting to forget it, to push it away. But I couldn't. The message had opened something, and now I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my coat, feeling an urge to leave the office. Maybe getting some air would help me think. But just as I was about to head out, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It wasn't just text, it was a photo. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. It was a picture from my childhood, one that I hadn't seen in years. It was of me and a group of kids from my neighborhood, all smiling and laughing, standing in the woods just outside our town. But there was something wrong with the photo. One of the faces in the picture was blurred, distorted, out of focus, as if something was hiding in the background. I squinted at the photo, trying to make sense of it. And then I saw it. There, just barely visible in the corner, was the shadow of a person. Their face was hidden in the darkness, but their body was unmistakable. They were standing just outside the frame, watching us, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that figure. It was him, the man who had been part of that night in the woods. The memories began to resurface, flooding back in a rush. My mind recoiled from them, but they kept coming. Flashes of the night I had tried so hard to forget. The woods, the laughter of my friends. And then the figure. The man who had been there with us, who had watched us, who had done things. The world seemed to spin around me, and I sank back into my chair, unable to breathe. The phone in my hand seemed to grow heavier, as if it were pulling me deeper into the past. I stared at the photo, my thoughts racing, trying to piece together what I had forgotten. What had really happened that night? What had I done? And why was this man, this stranger, contacting me now? I sat frozen in my chair, the phone trembling in my hands. The memories were rushing back now, fragmented flashes of that night, of the woods, of him. But the more I tried to piece them together, the more elusive they became. There were gaps, things I couldn't remember, parts of the story that were lost to me. The photo, the shadowy figure, the man who had been there, watching us, always lurking at the edge of my memories. I didn't want to remember. I couldn't. The more I tried, the more it hurt. But the stranger, the one who had been sending me these messages, was making it impossible to forget. They knew what I had done, what had happened that night. And they were waiting for me to face the truth. Another message buzzed on my phone. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was from. I told you, Sarah, you can't run from it. You promised you'd never forget. The words burned into my mind, and the fear I had been trying to push aside rushed back with full force. What had I promised? Suddenly, the door to my office opened. I turned in surprise, my heart leaping in my chest. Standing in the doorway was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows from the hallway. But there was something about him, something familiar, something terrifying. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the world around me tilt, as though the ground beneath me had shifted. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice low and cold, the same voice that had been in the messages. "It's time." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I couldn't move, couldn't think. His presence filled the room, suffocating me. The memories, the pain, everything I had tried so hard to forget was flooding back all at once. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his smile thin and twisted. "You don't remember what you did, what you promised." The room seemed to spin. I felt the walls closing in, the floor beneath me threatening to give way. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my head, trying to push the memories away. But I couldn't. They were there, clearer than ever. I saw it. The woods, the firelight, the laughter. But there was another memory, something darker, something I had tried to forget. And then I understood. The man wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just some person from my past. He was the one who had made me make the promise, the one who had kept the secret all these years. I had promised to keep quiet, to never speak of what happened that night in the woods. I had lied. I had lied to myself, pretending that nothing had happened, pretending I could forget. But now the truth was staring me in the face. "You promised, Sarah," the man repeated, stepping forward into the light. And as he did, I saw his face, twisted, contorted. Not the man I remembered, but something darker. A shadow of the past. A thing that had grown over the years, feeding off the secret we had shared. It's time to make good on that promise. The world went black. 9. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon when I first noticed it. Something I had overlooked countless times before. My grandmother's old family album. It sat on the shelf, gathering dust, right where it had always been, beside the other mementos of our past. I had always loved flipping through it as a child, looking at the black and white photographs of relatives I never met, imagining the lives they must have lived. But that afternoon, something was different. I was cleaning the attic when I pulled the album down from the shelf, dusting it off as I always did. My fingers lingered on the edges of the worn cover, the familiar warmth of nostalgia washing over me. I sat down in the corner of the attic, the soft light streaming in through the small window, and began flipping through the pages. Most of the photographs were ordinary. Families gathered around the dinner table, children playing in the yard, holiday celebrations frozen in time. Faces I recognized, people long gone, and yet each photo told a story, a glimpse into a life that had come before me. But then I came to one photo that I had never noticed before. It was of a family gathering, a group of people standing on the front porch of my grandmother's house, smiling at the camera. I recognized a few of them, my grandmother, my parents, some aunts and uncles. But there was someone else in the picture too, someone I had never seen before. A man, standing at the far end of the group, half shrouded in shadow. His face was obscured, as though something was deliberately blocking it. I squinted at the photo, trying to make out the details, but the more I looked, the more unsettling it became. The man was there, but he didn't belong. There was no other way to describe it. I stared at the photo for a long time, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I had spent so many hours looking at this album over the years, and I was certain I had never seen this photograph before. Who was he? Why had I never seen him at any of the family gatherings I attended? No one had ever mentioned him. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned the page, hoping to find an explanation, but there was nothing. No name, no note. Just another photo of a different family event, but this one, too, felt wrong. The same figure appeared again, just as unclear, just as out of place. I flipped through the pages more quickly now, searching for any clue. And then, with a gasp, I found it. Another photograph, much earlier this time. A much older one, dated from the 1940s, with my great-grandparents standing proudly in front of their house. In the photo, they were surrounded by other family members, and there, standing at the very back of the group, was the same man. This time, there was no shadow blocking his face, and he was smiling, wide and strange, his eyes too bright, too intent on the camera, as if he knew something no one else did. His face was perfectly visible now, and it made my stomach churn. I dropped the album in my lap, feeling the weight of the moment. The man, this man, was in photos spanning decades. I had never seen him at any family event. No one had ever spoken of him. My grandmother's family had never mentioned him. I could feel a knot tighten in my chest. My grandmother had never mentioned anything about him either, and she had passed away only a few months ago. I could still hear her soft voice in my mind, her stories of the past, her recollections of relatives I had never met. But she had never once mentioned this man. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I reached for the next photo, my hands trembling. This time, however, when I lifted the album, the pages fluttered, and one fell open all on its own. It wasn't a photograph this time, but a letter. A faded, yellowed piece of paper, tucked neatly between the pages. I held it in my hands, trying to steady myself. The handwriting was old and uneven, written in ink that had long since begun to fade. I could barely make out the words, but the ones I could read were enough to send a jolt of panic through me. We waited for you. Now you must join us. The letter had no signature, no name, and yet it was placed here as though someone had deliberately left it for me to find. My heart pounded in my chest. The words on the letter seemed to confirm the unease that had been gnawing at me. The man in the photographs, the strange feeling I couldn't shake, the way everything seemed to be tied together, he was waiting for something. Waiting for me. And then I heard it. A soft rustle from behind me as though someone, or something, had just entered the attic. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat still, the letter gripped tightly in my hand. The rustling sound came again, this time louder, closer. Someone, or something, was in the attic with me. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned around, expecting to see a figure standing there. But there was nothing, just the familiar stacks of old boxes, the forgotten furniture, and the dusty beams overhead. I scanned the room again, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The room was still. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with a presence I couldn't see. It was as if the entire attic had come alive with some dark energy surrounding me, waiting. I turned back to the album, hoping to shake the growing sense of unease, but as my gaze fell on the open pages, I noticed something else. The photograph I had been staring at, the one of the man smiling and staring into the camera, had changed. I blinked, my mind racing. It was impossible, but there it was. The man was no longer standing in the background, as he had been in the original photo. No, now he was in the foreground, and worse, he was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide open, staring with an intensity that made my stomach lurch. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands clammy. I hadn't imagined this. The photo had changed. But how? How was that possible? I slammed the album shut, trying to steady my breath, but the unease only deepened. The rustling sound came again, this time louder, unmistakable. It was coming from behind me. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, expecting to see something, but again, nothing. The attic remained empty. Only the shadows in the corners seemed to move, creeping closer with every passing second. I stepped forward, reaching for the small lamp beside me to turn it on, but before my fingers could touch the switch, I heard something else. A low, creaking sound coming from above me. I looked up, and there, at the far corner of the attic, was a door I had never noticed before. A small wooden door, hidden behind stacks of old furniture and boxes. It hadn't been there before, had it? I could feel a sudden, overwhelming pull toward it, an irresistible urge to open it, to step into whatever waited beyond it. The door was ajar, just a crack, and from inside came a faint muffled sound. Whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to crawl under my skin. I didn't want to go near it, I didn't want to open it. But the more I resisted, the more I felt the pull, like something was calling me from the other side. I stepped toward the door, every instinct telling me to run, to leave the house, but my feet carried me closer. With each step, the whispers grew louder, clearer. The words were still indistinguishable, but they were urgent now, desperate. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, the door creaked open by itself. Beyond it, there was a staircase, narrow, steep steps leading down into darkness. The faintest glow came from below, just enough to outline the steps, but it was enough to make my heart race. I couldn't stop myself. Something was urging me to go down, to follow whatever awaited me at the bottom. I hesitated, but then a thought flashed through my mind. The man from the photos, the letter, the whispering voices. Everything felt connected, and in that moment I realized that whatever was happening, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth. I stepped onto the first step. The moment my foot hit the stair, a cold wind rushed up from the darkness below, chilling me to the bone. I flinched, but I couldn't turn back. My legs carried me down, step by step, as the air grew colder and the glow from below grew brighter until I reached the bottom. At the foot of the stairs, the glow revealed something I hadn't expected. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves filled with old books, but in the center of the room was a table. A wooden table, covered with old papers, photographs, and, my heart stopped, the same dollhouse. But it wasn't like the one I'd seen in my grandmother's attic. This one was bigger, detailed, the tiny furniture in it more elaborate. And sitting atop it, in the center, was a small figure, a porcelain doll. But as I looked closer, something made my blood run cold. The doll had a face, a twisted, smirking face, its eyes wide open, staring directly at me. And behind it, standing in the shadows, was the man from the photographs. He was smiling now, his face fully visible, but there was no warmth in his expression. Only cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "You've finally come, Jessica," he said, his voice low and chilling, the words wrapped in a twisted sense of familiarity. And that's when I realized. It wasn't just the dollhouse. It wasn't just the photos. I had been here before. I had seen him before. The moment his voice echoed in the dimly lit room, a wave of recognition hit me like a tidal wave. My heart skipped a beat, and the air around me grew heavier. The figure standing in the shadows, he wasn't a stranger. His face, twisted and chilling as it was now, had once been so familiar. His cold, hollow eyes reflected something deep in my memory, something buried beneath layers of forgotten years. "I remember you," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The man in the shadows smiled, a cruel twist of his lips that sent a shudder down my spine. "Of course you do, Jessica." His voice was smooth, like a long-forgotten lullaby, but there was no comfort in it. I've always been here, waiting for you to return. Just like the dollhouse, just like the photographs, just like all the pieces of the past. You've always known. I took a shaky step back, my pulse racing. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as if closing around me. The porcelain doll on the table was still staring at me, its unblinking eyes seemingly alive with some dark, malicious energy. "No," I gasped, taking another step away from the table. You can't be real. None of this is real." "Oh, but it is," he replied, his voice growing louder, more commanding. "You just don't want to remember. You don't want to face what you've forgotten. The dollhouse, the photographs, the letter, the man in the shadows. It all started to come together, but it wasn't making any sense. Why had I forgotten? Why was he waiting for me? What did he want? And then the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I was him. I was connected to him in a way I couldn't yet fully understand. My memories, my childhood, my family, and all these pieces, these photographs, these toys, were part of me. But I had been hiding from them, hiding from him. The man stepped closer, his form becoming clearer now, emerging from the darkness. His tall, gaunt figure filled the room, and the air seemed to vibrate with his presence. "You're just like them," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. "You belong here with us." His hand reached out, pale fingers brushing against the edge of the dollhouse. And as if on cue, the dolls began to move. One by one, they shifted, their eyes following me, their tiny hands stretching out toward me like they were beckoning me to join them. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the dolls crawled across the table, the soft scraping of porcelain on wood echoing in the silence. "It's time to come home, Jessica," the man said, his smile widening, showing teeth. "It's time to join us in the place you've always belonged." The dollhouse, the man, the photographs. It wasn't just a twisted memory. It was my legacy, my fate. I had been called here, to this house, to this room. I had been waiting for this moment, whether I knew it or not. And as the dolls closed in around me, as the man's shadow enveloped me, I realized with sickening clarity that there was no escaping this. I was already part of it. I was part of the darkness, part of the twisted story that had always been mine to finish. And so, as the world around me faded into shadow, I gave in. It's strange how certain things from our past can stay with us, even when we think we've forgotten them. For me, it was the family album, the thick, leather-bound book that sat on the shelf in the living room, covered in dust and memories. I used to flip through its pages as a child, fascinated by the pictures of my ancestors, their smiles frozen in time. I'd imagine their lives, their stories, and wonder what it would be like to live in a world so different from mine. But there was always one photo that made my skin crawl. It was an old black and white photo taken many years ago. My grandparents were standing in front of their house, smiling as they held their newborn daughter, my mother, in their arms. A perfect family, captured in a perfect moment. At least, that's how it seemed, until I looked closer. In the background of the photo, just barely visible, was a face. It was a shadowy, indistinct figure, its features obscured by the grainy quality of the photo. But the face, there was something about it that disturbed me. It didn't belong. It didn't look like anyone I recognized, and yet I had seen it before. I couldn't explain why, but every time I looked at that picture, a sense of unease washed over me, like something was lurking just beyond the frame, watching. As I grew older, I stopped looking at the album. The strange feeling it gave me was too much to bear, and I convinced myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But that photo, that face, always lingered in the back of my mind. One evening, As I was cleaning out the attic, I found the album again, buried under a pile of old newspapers and boxes. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age, but the familiar weight of it in my hands brought a strange sense of nostalgia. Without thinking, I sat down on the floor and opened the book to the page with the photo of my grandparents. The moment my eyes fell on the picture, the unease returned, stronger than ever. The face in the background, it was clearer now, more distinct. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a person, a man. And as I stared at the photo, a chilling thought crossed my mind. How had I never noticed him before? I leaned closer to the picture, squinting in the dim light, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man in the background was staring directly at the camera, his eyes locked onto mine. His features were still blurry, but there was no mistaking the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were hollow, black, as though someone, had erased his identity from the world, leaving only an empty shell behind. I ran my fingers along the photo, tracing the outlines of the people I knew so well, my grandparents, my mother. But the man in the background, he was different. His presence in the photo felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. I turned the page quickly, my heart racing, but the feeling didn't go away. The face had burned itself into my memory, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man in the photo. Who was he? How had he ended up in the picture? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to know. There had to be an explanation. There was no way this was just some random stranger who had wandered into the frame by accident. I sat up in bed, my mind racing. The photo had been taken decades ago, but what if someone knew the truth? What if someone could tell me who he was? I had to ask my mother. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to ask my mother about the man in the photo. There was no way I could just let this go, not after the way his face had haunted me since last night. I dialed her number, trying to keep my voice steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something that had been buried for years was beginning to surface. "Mom?" I said when she picked up. "I found something in the family album, and I need to ask you about it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. My mother's voice was quiet when she spoke. "What did you find?" I hesitated. "There's a photo of you and Grandpa and Grandma when you were a baby, but there's someone else in the background, a man. I've never seen him before, and I don't know why, but it feels like he's watching me in the photo." There was another long pause. My mother's voice came through the line, softer this time, almost hesitant. "You shouldn't have been looking through that album. Some things are best left forgotten." I could hear the unease in her voice, and I felt my stomach twist with anxiety. "Who is he, Mom? Who is the man in the photo?" "I told you," she said, her voice firmer now. "You need to leave the past in the past. There's nothing to worry about." But her words didn't reassure me. They only made me more certain that something was wrong. I had to know. "Mom, please. I need to know who he is. It's been bothering me. I need answers." There was a long silence, and then my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't understand. You were too young to remember, but I'm telling you, you don't want to know." I sat there, stunned by her response. "What happened, Mom? What are you hiding?" There was a faint sound on the other end of the line, like a muffled sigh. "Listen to me, sweetheart. That man. He wasn't supposed to be in that photo. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. You're not ready to hear about it. Some things, some people, you just have to let go." I felt a chill wash over me. Let go of what? Who was he? What happened? She didn't answer. Instead, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, the cold silence ringing in my ears. My mother had hung up. She hadn't answered my questions. And now, the unease I had felt last night was growing into something more tangible. A knot in my stomach. A sense that I was being drawn into something dark. Something I wasn't meant to understand. I needed answers. There was no way I could just let it go now. I returned to the attic, the family album still open on the floor where I had left it. The photo was still there. The man's face now burned into my mind, his hollow eyes staring out at me. I ran my fingers over the picture, trying to ignore the cold chill creeping up my spine. There had to be something else. Some clue, something that would tell me who he was, why he was in that photo. And then, as my fingers brushed across the photo, I felt it. A slight indentation in the corner of the page. A faint scratch, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. I pulled the page back and, to my surprise, found a second photo tucked behind it. The second photo was smaller, faded, but it was unmistakable. The man from the first photo was there, standing in front of my grandparents' house again, but this time, he wasn't in the background. He was in the foreground, and in his hands, he was holding something, a child's doll. I stared at the photo, my breath caught in my throat. The man was unmistakable, standing proudly in front of my grandparents' house. But what chilled me to the bone wasn't his presence. It was the doll he was holding. It was familiar, yet foreign. Something about it gnawing at the edges of my mind, like a forgotten memory clawing its way to the surface. I knew that doll. I had seen it before. My mother had kept it in a drawer in the attic, hidden away, along with other things I was never allowed to touch. It had always seemed so insignificant, a child's plaything from a time long past, but seeing it now, held by the man in the photo, twisted something inside me. There was something dark attached to it, something I couldn't quite explain. The photo was a clear contradiction to everything I had been told. My grandparents had always been the pillars of our family. They had been good, kind people, and their home had always been a sanctuary. But this man, this stranger, didn't belong there, and neither did the doll. Not in the way it was being held, not with the strange, unsettling expression on his face. As I continued to stare at the photo, my hands began to shake. It was as if the man's eyes were pulling me into the past, forcing me to confront something I had long tried to forget. The shadows in the photo seemed to come alive, swirling around the man and the doll, wrapping them in a veil of mystery and dread. It felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready for. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise behind me, a soft scrape like something shifting in the attic. My heart raced as I spun around, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. Just the quiet dim light of the attic casting long shadows on the walls. I turned back to the photo, and the chill in the room seemed to intensify. The man's face seemed to change, his smile widening ever so slightly, like he knew I was finally beginning to understand. My hands grew clammy as I slowly reached for the photo again, but as soon as my fingers touched it, the image shifted. The man was gone. In his place, there was only the doll. And it was no longer just a doll. The eyes were wide open, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The once innocent porcelain face was now twisted, distorted. The mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, too wide for anything human. I stumbled back, dropping the photo in horror. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me. The whisper from the letter echoed in my mind again. The shadow is waiting. Suddenly, I realized what had been missing. what had been pulling me into this nightmare. The shadow wasn't just a presence in the house, it was a memory. A part of my past that I had buried so deep I didn't recognize it until now. That night, the night I had tried to forget, it wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. The man in the photo, the doll, and the shadow were all tied together. And now, they were coming back for me. I ran to the stairs, desperate to escape, but the house seemed to shift, its walls twisting, the doors closing, trapping me inside. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway behind me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, my body frozen in place. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, I heard a voice. Soft, gentle, but filled with a chilling certainty. You found me. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the shadow stretching along the floor, creeping toward me, inch by inch. The doll's twisted smile seemed to follow me, its eyes never leaving my face. And then, everything went dark.